All right, before we let the night really settle in, let me do one small, gentle thing. If you enjoy these long, slow conversations with the past, if they keep you company while you rest, or work, or drift somewhere in between, you can like the video or subscribe, only if you want to. There's no rush. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I always find that strangely comforting. The idea that this voice is landing in different rooms, different nights, different kinds of silence. Now, let's ease into things. Not with an answer, not with a date, not with a big historical announcement, just with something very small. Smoke. Because before anyone ever thought of weed as a substance, before it had names, reputations, arguments attached to it, smoke was already there. Smoke was normal. Smoke was unavoidable. If you lived anywhere before modern ventilation, smoke was just part of being alive. Fires for warmth, fires for cooking, fires for light. Smoke in your hair, your clothes, your lungs. No one asked whether inhaling smoke was a good idea. It simply happened. And that's important, because when people ask, when did people start smoking weed? They imagine a moment of invention, someone deciding, someone rolling something for the first time. But that's not how it works. People didn't invent smoking weed. They were already breathing smoke all the time. What they did instead was notice that some smoke felt different, not immediately dramatic, not fireworks, just noticeable, a little heavier in the chest, a little warmer behind the eyes, a little more likely to make people sit down instead of stand. At first, that difference probably felt accidental. Someone throws a handful of dried plant matter onto hot stones. Maybe it's mixed with other herbs. Maybe it's meant to smell good. Maybe it's meant to cover another smell. Maybe it's part of a ritual that no one fully remembers the origin of anymore. The smoke thickens. People cough. Someone laughs about it. Someone else feels quiet. And then nothing officially happens. No announcement. No tradition. No name. Just a memory. And memories are where habits begin. Because the next time smoke is needed, someone remembers that plant. Not because it was special, but because it worked. That's how most permanent human behaviors start. Not with intention, but with, well, that seemed to do something. You see this pattern everywhere in human history. Temporary shelters that become cities, emergency rules that become laws, shortcuts that become roads. Smoking weed follows the same logic. At first, it's not weed. It's just a plant that happened to be nearby. In many places, cannabis grew wild, or semi-wild, or as a secondary crop next to things people actually cared about, more rope fibers, seeds, oil. No one was growing it to get high. They were growing it to tie things together. Literally, rope, nets, sails, cloth, bags, thread. It was a background plant, a useful plant, a boring plant. And boring plants don't get banned, but boring plants still get burned. Scraps get tossed into fires, stems, leaves, leftovers, whatever isn't good for anything else. And every once in a while, someone notices that when this plant burns, the smoke behaves differently. It lingers. It doesn't rush upward the same way. It hangs around people's faces. It invites sitting. That's not poetic. That's practical. Smoke that rises too fast is annoying. Smoke that lingers is social. So people start using it in enclosed spaces. Not because they're chasing intoxication, But because enclosed spaces already existed, tents, huts, bathhouses, burial chambers, small rooms with low ceilings and poor airflow, in those spaces, smoke becomes an event, whether you want it to or not. And once smoke becomes an event, it becomes shared. That's another key thing people forget. Early cannabis inhalation wasn't solitary. It was collective. No one stepped outside to take a hit. There was no outside in the modern sense. There was just inside, and cold, and darkness. So people sat together. They breathed the same air. And whatever that smoke did, it did it to everyone at once. Which is how something temporary starts to feel meaningful. Because shared sensations feel important even when they're accidental. Imagine a funeral, a ritual, a gathering. Someone burns something fragrant. Someone else adds something stronger. The smoke thickens. People begin to feel altered, not dramatically, not necessarily joyfully, but enough to notice that the moment feels different. Time slows, voices drop, movements soften, and later, when someone asks, "Why do we do it this way?" the answer is vague. Because we always have. Because it's proper. Because it helps. Helps with what? No one is quite sure anymore. And that's when a temporary solution becomes tradition. What's fascinating is how long this phase lasts. Centuries pass where cannabis is inhaled without being named as a drug. It's just part of smoke culture. And smoke culture is everywhere. In the steppes, people sit inside tents filled with vapor and laugh about how loud everyone gets. In mountainous regions, smoke is used in rituals because it carries things upward: prayers, spirits, intentions, explanations for things no one can explain. The plant doesn't need a mythology at first. It borrows one. Smoke already has meaning. Fire already has meaning. Cannabis just slides into the existing framework quietly. This is where irony begins. Because later societies will argue endlessly about whether smoking weed is natural or corrupting or foreign or dangerous. But at the beginning, it's almost aggressively mundane. Someone threw it on the fire. That's it. And then people noticed they wanted to do that again. Not constantly, not obsessively, just again, which is how repetition begins. And repetition is the seed of permanence. At some point, people stop tossing the plant in randomly. They dry it, not for potency, for storage. Damp plants smoke poorly. Dry plants burn evenly. So now there's preparation. Still not a culture, just convenience. But preparation creates preference. Someone says, "This batch worked better than the last." Someone else notices that certain plants produce stronger smoke. And now selection begins. Not breeding yet, just choosing. And choosing is powerful, because once humans start choosing, evolution starts listening. Plants that produce noticeable effects get used more. Plants that don't get ignored. Over generations, that matters. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. And still, no one is saying, "We are now smoking weed." They're just saying, "Use that one." What's also happening during this time is that smoking itself is evolving. People get tired of coughing. They get tired of smoke in their eyes. They get tired of ash falling into food. So they start to control it. They put the burning material in bowls, in containers, in hollowed objects. At first, these aren't pipes. They're just ways to keep embers from spilling. A bowl keeps the fire contained. A tube keeps smoke directed. This isn't about intoxication, it's about cleanliness. But once you can direct smoke, you can also concentrate it. And concentration changes experience. Suddenly, the same amount of plant material produces a stronger effect, not because the plant changed, because the tool did. This happens over and over again in human history. Tools amplify behavior. Then people blame the behavior instead of the tool. So as pipes slowly appear in different regions made of clay, wood, stone, bone smoking becomes more intentional. Not more moral, not more rebellious, just more efficient. And efficiency makes things noticeable. Now, instead of an entire room slowly filling with smoke, one person inhales deeply. They feel it faster, stronger, more personally, and that's when societies start paying attention. Because private experiences are harder to control than shared rituals. A room full of smoke is a ceremony. A pipe in one person's hand is suspicious. Still, for a long time, no one panics. Because smoking itself is becoming normal anyway. Other plants are smoked. Resins, tobacco later on. Smoke becomes a social technology. A reason to sit. A reason to talk. A reason to pause. Cannabis just joins the club. In some places, it stays associated with religion. In others, with labor. In others, with rest. Sometimes all three. And here's where human absurdity really starts to shine. Because once something becomes common enough, people argue about why it exists. Religious scholars debate whether it counts as an intoxicant or something else entirely. Lawmakers argue whether it corrupts workers or keeps them manageable. Doctors argue whether it's medicine or vice. Meanwhile, the people actually smoking it are mostly just tired. Tired from work, tired from walking, tired from being alive in difficult conditions. And they do what humans always do when something makes life slightly easier. They keep doing it. Not forever, not constantly, just often enough to matter. Over time, certain smoking methods become associated with certain groups, not because of biology, because of convenience. Ascetics smoke from communal pipes because they don't own much. Workers smoke in groups because they live together. Soldiers smoke because boredom is heavier than armor. None of this is coordinated. It's messy, and messiness is key. Because when something spreads messily, it resists clean explanations later. Historians argue about dates. Regions argue about origins. Governments argue about responsibility. But the truth is, smoking weed doesn't start in one place. It emerges, like a habit you can't remember forming, and then, much later, much, much later, paper enters the story. Paper changes everything. Because paper makes smoke portable. You don't need a room. You don't need a bowl. You don't need a shared space. You can walk with it. And walking with smoke is new. That's when weed becomes visible in public. And visibility invites judgment. That's when authorities start asking questions. Who is smoking? Why here? Why like that? And suddenly, people act as if smoking weed just appeared. As if it hasn't been quietly happening for thousands of years in tents, caves, bathhouses, backrooms, funerals, fields, and evenings no one bothered to write about. History has a strange habit of noticing things only when they become inconvenient. Before that, they're just background noise, like smoke, and smoke has always been with us. So when did people start smoking weed? They started when they were already smoking everything else. They started when fire was common, when boredom was constant, when plants were nearby, when someone said, "That smells different," and no one told them to stop. And once started, it never really stopped. It just changed shape, changed tools, changed stories, changed enemies. But the rhythm stayed the same. A small improvisation, a temporary solution, repeated until no one remembers it was ever temporary. And that is where we are now. Still breathing smoke, still arguing about it, still pretending it all began much later than it actually did. And if you sit with that thought long enough, it starts to feel very human, almost comforting, almost funny, and definitely unfinished. And what's interesting is that once something becomes familiar enough, people stop asking how it began. They only start asking when it becomes inconvenient. For a very long time, smoking weed wasn't inconvenient. It didn't disrupt governments. It didn't challenge borders. It didn't threaten industries. It lived in the margins of daily life, which is where most human habits prefer to stay. Think about how many things you do every day that you've never once questioned. The way you sit, the way you rest, the way you fill the silence. No one asks when that started. Cannabis smoke lived in that same category. It filled pauses. It softened edges. It made long evenings feel shorter and short evenings feel survivable. In some places, it stayed tied to ritual. In others, it drifted into labor. And in many, it quietly became a companion to waiting. Waiting is a huge part of human history that rarely gets discussed. Waiting for food, waiting for orders, waiting for weather, waiting for death. Honestly, smoke makes waiting tolerable, not exciting, not productive, just tolerable. And tolerable things have remarkable staying power. So, when pipes became common, they didn't announce a revolution. They just made waiting more efficient. You didn't need a whole room anymore. You didn't need a ceremony. You could sit on a step, lean against a wall, share something small with someone who didn't ask questions. And slowly, that intimacy changed the tone of smoking. It wasn't collective in the same way anymore. It became quieter, more personal, and oddly, more suspicious. Because societies trust crowds more than individuals. A group ritual feels safe. A single person altering their state feels unpredictable. That's when rules begin to form. Not clear rules, not consistent rules, just opinions with authority behind them. Some leaders decide it's harmless. Others decide it's dangerous. Many decide it's useful until it isn't. And cannabis gets swept into these decisions without ever being asked. In one century, it's a medicine. In another, a vice. In another, a tradition worth protecting. In another, a threat that must be controlled. The plant doesn't change. The story around it does. What's almost funny is how often laws appear long after the habit is deeply established, as if banning something retroactively could erase centuries of muscle memory. People already know how to do this. They already know how it feels. They already know how to hide it, share it, ration it, which is why enforcement always feels theatrical. A performance, officials making examples, public punishments, moral speeches. And somewhere nearby, someone is still sitting in a corner, doing exactly what humans have always done when faced with stress, boredom, or too much reality. They pause, they inhale, they wait, The arrival of tobacco complicates everything further, because tobacco makes smoking normal in places where it wasn't before. Pipes, cafes, water pipes, social rules around sharing smoke, these all become mainstream. Cannabis doesn't need to fight for space. It just borrows it. Sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, sometimes mixed together so no one can quite tell where one ends and the other begins. That ambiguity is powerful. It allows habits to survive under scrutiny, and survival, not pleasure, is the real through line here. People didn't keep smoking weed for thousands of years because it was rebellious. They kept doing it because it fit into the cracks of life. The parts no one governs well, the moments between tasks, the hours between obligations, the mental space between fear and sleep. Even now, that hasn't changed much. Only the language around it has. And language is loud. It makes things feel newer than they are, more dangerous than they've ever been, more important too. But underneath all that noise, the behavior is almost embarrassingly simple. Someone notices that time feels different, that silence feels kinder, that waiting feels less sharp, and they repeat whatever made that happen. Again, not forever, just again. And that repetition stretches across generations so quietly that no one notices it becoming history until someone asks the question out loud. When did people start smoking weed? And the answer, inconveniently, is that they never really started. They just never stopped. They were already sitting near the fire, already breathing smoke, already looking for ways to make long nights shorter. And one plant accidentally happened to help, so it stayed. And it stayed long enough that now we argue about it, which is usually a sign that something has been with us for a very long time, and will probably continue to be long after the arguments fade back into smoke. And there's another quiet thing that happens once something stays around long enough. People stop noticing it as itself. It becomes atmosphere. Cannabis smoke, for most of its history, isn't treated like a substance with a personality. It's treated like a condition, like heat, like humidity, like the smell of animals nearby. Something you factor in without thinking. If the smoke is thick, you open a flap. If it's thin, you lean closer. If it makes you laugh, you laugh. If it makes you quiet, you let it. No one writes manuals for this. That's another reason it takes so long to appear clearly in history. Histories love rules. They love institutions. They love declarations. But cannabis smoking lives in the unrecorded parts of life, in pauses, in afterthoughts, in evenings no one bothers to describe because nothing important happened, and those evenings add up. Imagine how many generations sat beside fires and never thought to explain why they felt calmer afterward. Imagine how many people assumed everyone felt that way, that this was just how nights were. This is where misunderstanding creeps in later. Modern people tend to assume that intoxication is always intentional, planned, sought after. But most early cannabis smoking doesn't look like that at all. It looks incidental, like standing too close to a fire and realizing you don't mind. And once you don't mind, you stop stepping away. That's how proximity turns into preference. And preference, given enough time, turns into habit. What's especially human is how often people later invent reasons for habits they already have. They attach philosophy, they attach morality, they attach spirituality, sometimes sincerely, sometimes opportunistically. Smoke becomes cleansing, or corrupting, or enlightening, or weakening, depending entirely on who's talking. Meanwhile, the person actually inhaling is usually thinking about something far less abstract. Their feet hurt. Their back hurts. Their thoughts won't settle. The day felt longer than it needed to. Smoke softens edges. That's not mystical. It's mechanical. But humans love turning mechanics into meaning. So traditions form. Someone insists the smoke must be taken a certain way, at a certain time, with certain words. And now, something accidental has etiquette. Etiquette is always a sign that a behavior has stayed too long to ignore, because etiquette exists to manage repetition. And repetition is the only thing cannabis smoking ever truly needed. No marketing, no evangelism, just repetition. Over time, regions develop their own rhythms. Some prefer enclosed spaces. Some prefer open air. Some prefer shared devices. Some prefer solitary ones. None of these choices are ideological. They're architectural. You smoke the way your space allows you to smoke. A tent encourages sharing. A narrow room encourages stillness. A long walk encourages portability. And portability is dangerous to authority because it removes the need for place. Once smoking doesn't require a location, it becomes harder to observe, harder to regulate, harder to pretend it isn't happening. This is when names start to matter more. When something needs to be controlled, it first needs to be labeled. So the plant acquires identities, some respectful, some dismissive, some fearful, and suddenly people argue about what it is rather than what it does. This is a classic human distraction, because arguing about definitions feels productive. Meanwhile, the behavior continues uninterrupted. It always does. You can see this pattern repeat in every era where cannabis smoking becomes visible enough to annoy someone in power. There's a moment of outrage, a moment of certainty, a moment of enforcement, and then adaptation. People adjust where they smoke, how they smoke, who they smoke with. They don't usually stop. Stopping would require replacing what the habit was quietly doing for them, and societies are rarely interested in providing substitutes. They prefer prohibitions, which is much easier, especially when the habit looks optional from the outside. From the inside, though, it rarely feels optional. It feels helpful, not in a dramatic way, in a bare minimum way, like leaning back against something solid. And that's why cannabis smoking survives centuries of disapproval, because it doesn't promise transformation. It promises tolerance, tolerance of boredom, tolerance of waiting, tolerance of silence. And those are universal problems. Long before people argued about when it started, they were already using it to get through nights that felt too long. Long before it had enemies, it had companions. And companions are hard to evict. So the story doesn't really move forward. It circles. Fire, smoke, people, tools appear, rules appear, arguments appear. But the core behavior stays remarkably unchanged. Someone pauses, someone inhales, someone lets time stretch without resisting it, and then they do it again, not because history told them to, but because, quietly, it works. And that's usually the most durable explanation humans ever need. And there's something else that quietly helps habits survive for thousands of years. Confusion, not the dramatic kind, the small, ordinary kind, the kind where people aren't even sure what they're experiencing. For a long time, people didn't agree on what cannabis did. Some thought it warmed the body. Some thought it cooled the mind. Some thought it made spirits closer. Some thought it simply made hunger louder. And a lot of people thought it was just smoke. That's it. No substance. No identity. Just a smell that lingered longer than most. And when people don't fully understand something, they tend to use it more freely. Certainty creates rules. Uncertainty creates habits. So cannabis lived in uncertainty. It got mixed with other plants, burned alongside resins, thrown into fires with scraps and leftovers. Sometimes people felt something, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they blamed the plant, sometimes they blamed the day. That ambiguity protected it, because you can't easily ban what you can't clearly define. And you definitely can't stop people from repeating something that doesn't look intentional. From the outside, it just looks like people sitting. From the inside, it feels like time loosening its grip. That's a powerful thing to give someone who spends most of their life waiting. Waiting is where cannabis really settles in. Waiting for guards to change shifts. Waiting for animals to move. Waiting for orders. Waiting for pain to dull. And the people who wait the most are rarely the ones writing history. They're guards. They're shepherds. They're laborers. They're the ones awake when everyone else sleeps. They don't need transformation. They need endurance. So smoking becomes a tool for that. Not flashy, not celebrated, just reliable. It helps shoulders drop, helps standing turn into sitting, helps silence feel less aggressive. And because these people live on the edges of society, their habits stay there too, unnoticed, unrecorded, until they don't. Because habits have a way of drifting inward. A guard shows someone else. A worker shares. A soldier brings it home. And suddenly, something that belonged to the margins appears closer to the center. That's when adults start paying attention. That's when elders notice. When leaders notice. When rules begin to hover. It's never the first generation that panics. It's always the one that realizes the habit didn't disappear, that it stayed. And staying makes people nervous, because staying implies usefulness. And usefulness is hard to argue against. So instead, people argue about meaning. They argue whether it weakens or strengthens, whether it corrupts or purifies, whether it's foreign or familiar. These arguments repeat endlessly, across centuries, with different words, and they never quite land, because the people actually using it aren't doing it for meaning. They're doing it because it fits. It fits into night. It fits into boredom. It fits into exhaustion. And night is always winning. As smoking tools improve, the habit gets quieter, more private. A pipe replaces a room. A bowl replaces a fire. Now you don't need permission. You don't need ceremony. You just need a moment. And moments are dangerous to authority, because moments don't announce themselves. They don't gather crowds. They slip between responsibilities. This is where cannabis becomes more visible and more misunderstood at the same time. People see the behavior, but not the reason. They see someone pause, but not why they needed to. They see smoke, but not the waiting that led up to it. And when people can't see the need, they assume indulgence, which is unfair, but very human. At some point, the habit becomes associated with youth, not because youth invented it, but because youth have fewer places to hide. Their pauses are more noticeable. Their rest looks suspicious. And now, cannabis gets a reputation, not for what it does, but for who is seen doing it. This is where humor quietly lives, because the same behavior performed by a tired old worker in the dark is invisible, but performed by a young person in the open becomes a problem. The habit didn't change, the audience did, and audiences shape morality more than facts ever do. As time goes on, names become sharper, definitions become louder. Cannabis is no longer just smoke, it's an idea, and ideas attract attention. But habits don't disappear just because they're noticed. They adapt. They move indoors. They move later. They move quietly. They become jokes. They become codes. They become shared glances instead of shared rooms, which makes them harder to erase, because now they live in memory as much as behavior. And memory is stubborn. Even today, most people who smoke aren't chasing rebellion, they're chasing relief. Relief from tension, from noise, from the pressure to be constantly alert, which is ironic, because societies that demand constant alertness often condemn the tools people use to survive it. But irony has never stopped repetition, and repetition is the only reason this habit still exists. Not ideology, not culture wars, not movements, just repetition. A simple thing done again and again and again until it becomes unremarkable, until someone decides it shouldn't be, and then the cycle begins all over again. Fire, smoke, people, waiting, always waiting, and finding small ways to make that waiting feel less sharp. That's not a trend. That's not a phase. That's just human behavior doing what it always does when left alone long enough. And it's probably why this story never really ends. It just keeps circling back to the same quiet moment. Someone sitting, someone breathing, someone letting time pass without fighting it, and deciding, without saying it out loud, that they'll probably do this again. And there's a strange comfort in how little this habit asks from people. It doesn't demand belief. It doesn't demand commitment. It doesn't even demand understanding. It just asks for a moment where nothing else is urgent, which is why it settles so naturally into lives that feel overfilled. Think about how many human routines exist simply to slow things down. Tea, walking longer routes than necessary, sitting even when there's nowhere to sit. Smoking fits into that category. It doesn't push you forward. It doesn't pull you backward. It suspends you. And suspension is addictive in its own quiet way. Not dramatic addiction, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that whispers, "This is fine, stay here." So people stayed. They stayed near fires. They stayed near doorways. They stayed just outside of responsibilities. And every time they stayed, the habit got a little deeper. Not stronger, deeper. Depth is harder to remove than intensity. Intensity burns out. Depth sinks in. That's why so many societies tolerated cannabis smoking for centuries without really caring. It didn't create chaos. It created stillness. And stillness rarely alarms anyone until productivity becomes a moral obligation. That's when the tone shifts. That's when stillness looks like laziness. Pauses look like disobedience. Waiting looks like refusal. But for most of history, productivity wasn't constant. Life moved in pulses. Work, wait, rest, repeat. Cannabis fit neatly into the waiting and the resting. It didn't interrupt work. It came after, or between, or when work blurred into endurance. That's why it shows up so often among people whose jobs involve long stretches of doing very little. punctuated by moments of urgency. Guards, sailors, shepherds, night watchmen, people whose bodies are alert while their minds drift. Smoke gives the mind something to do while the body stays ready. That balance is rare. And when something provides balance, people protect it quietly. They don't advocate for it. They don't write about it. They just make sure it's available. That's how cannabis survives transitions. Empires fall, borders shift, languages disappear, but the habit slips through because it doesn't belong to institutions. It belongs to evenings. Evenings don't get archived, they get lived. Another odd thing happens as time passes. People start forgetting that the habit was ever new. They assume it's ancient, but not introduced. Just there, like fire itself. This creates a strange double memory. On one hand, people argue it's foreign. On the other, they insist it's traditional. Sometimes, in the same sentence, that contradiction never resolves, because both sides are partially right. Cannabis moves with people. People move constantly, so every place can claim it arrived and that it always existed. That ambiguity makes ownership impossible, and things without clear ownership tend to linger. Nobody feels fully responsible for removing them. As smoking devices evolve, the habit becomes more flexible. It adapts to different tempos of life. A long pipe for slow evenings, a small one for quick pauses, a shared one for conversation, a private one for silence. Each variation changes the experience slightly, not enough to redefine it, just enough to keep it interesting. That's important. Habits die when they become boring. Cannabis avoided boredom by changing shape without changing purpose. The purpose stayed simple: make time softer. Everything else was optional. When paper enters the picture and smoking becomes mobile, the habit changes again. Now it travels. It crosses thresholds. It leaks into public spaces. And that visibility creates stories. Stories exaggerate. Stories simplify. Suddenly, the habit looks new because people are seeing it more. But seeing isn't the same as starting. It's just noticing late. This is where fear often enters. Fear of spread, fear of influence, fear of loss of control. But fear rarely understands scale. It reacts to presence, not prevalence. Cannabis didn't suddenly become common, it became visible. And visibility is provocative, especially when it involves people choosing to pause, choosing not to rush, choosing not to be sharp. Societies built on urgency don't know what to do with chosen softness, so they name it, they classify it, they debate it. And through all of that, the habit continues doing exactly what it always did. It waits. It waits out arguments. It waits out laws. It waits out generations. Because waiting is its natural environment. And humans are very good at waiting, as long as they have something to soften it. That's why this story doesn't move in a straight line. It loops. Fire returns. Night returns. People return. The same small scene repeats with slight variations. A different place, a different tool, a different set of worries. But the posture is the same. Someone sitting instead of standing. Someone leaning instead of pacing. Someone breathing instead of thinking. And that posture, that moment, is the real origin. Not a date, not a culture, not a movement. Just a human choosing, again, to let time stretch without resisting it. And once that choice exists, It keeps being made, quietly, patiently, as if it never needed permission in the first place. And something else quietly keeps this habit alive longer than anyone expects. Familiarity, not love, not obsession, just familiarity. The kind where something feels so ordinary that it stops feeling like a choice. People didn't wake up thinking, "Today I will smoke weed." They woke up thinking, "Today will be long." And long days have a way of collecting small comforts around them. At first, the comfort isn't even the feeling, it's the routine, the preparation, the sitting down, the moment where the body knows what comes next. Bodies remember things faster than minds. That's why so many early users wouldn't have described themselves as users at all. They were just repeating something that felt normal, like sitting in the same place every evening, like leaning against the same wall. And when something becomes part of posture, it stops needing explanation. This is where confusion quietly helps the habit survive. Because people don't fully agree on what it's doing, they stop arguing about it. Some say it relaxes. Some say it sharpens. Some say it opens something. Some say it closes something. All of them might be right, or none of them. But disagreement keeps things flexible. Flexible habits are resilient. Rigid habits break. So cannabis stays flexible. It blends into whatever life requires of it. In times of scarcity, it becomes something shared. In times of control, it becomes something hidden. In times of boredom, it becomes something passed around. And in times of fear, it becomes quiet. Quiet habits last the longest because quiet doesn't attract attention. People often assume survival belongs to the strongest things, but survival usually belongs to the least noticeable, the things that don't announce themselves, the things that don't demand loyalty. Cannabis never asked to be defended. It just waited. Waiting is its most consistent behavior. Waiting for fire, waiting for night, waiting for people to sit down, and people always sit down eventually, especially when standing feels unnecessary. Over generations, this waiting becomes embedded, not as ideology, as muscle memory. A hand knows where to reach, a body knows when to slow, a mind knows when to stop pushing. No one teaches this formally. It spreads sideways, from person to person, from evening to evening. That sideways movement is hard to trace, which is why later historians argue endlessly about origins. They're looking for lines, but this habit spreads like fog. It doesn't travel in straight paths. It settles where conditions allow, and conditions are usually emotional, not geographic. Fatigue, isolation, repetition, those conditions exist everywhere, which is why cannabis appears everywhere, eventually. Sometimes it's welcomed, sometimes tolerated, sometimes condemned, but rarely erased. Erasure requires replacement. And societies are very bad at replacing quiet comforts. They're better at naming them. Naming turns habits into problems, and problems invite solutions. Solutions invite control, but control rarely understands what it's trying to replace. So people adapt. They smoke later. They smoke differently. They smoke less visibly. They don't stop needing the pause. That need doesn't go away. It just waits. And waiting is patient. That patience is misunderstood as weakness, but it's the opposite. It's endurance. That's why this habit keeps reappearing after every attempt to remove it. Not because it's powerful, because it's modest. It doesn't promise escape. It offers tolerance. Tolerance of long nights. Tolerance of repetitive days. tolerance of being awake with nothing urgent to do. And humans have always needed help with that, especially when life offers very few breaks. The longer societies run on speed and urgency, the more noticeable this contrast becomes. A habit that slows instead of accelerates. That chooses sitting over moving, breathing over speaking. Those choices look suspicious when speed is worshipped. But suspicion doesn't erase need. It just pushes it inward, which is where this habit is most comfortable anyway. Inside rooms, inside moments, inside pauses no one monitors. And that's why the story never reaches a climax. There's no dramatic beginning, no single turning point, just a long accumulation of evenings where people discovered that time could feel different and decided not to forget that. And what people rarely notice is how often this habit survives by being incomplete. Incomplete explanations, incomplete rules, incomplete memories. No one ever quite agrees on the first time they tried it, or why, or whether it even mattered. That vagueness protects it, because certainty creates pressure, and pressure invites control. So cannabis stays in the half-known. People remember the posture more than the moment, the way someone sat a little longer than usual, the way conversation slowed without stopping, the way silence didn't feel like a failure. Those details don't demand stories. They don't insist on being told. They just settle, and settling is how habits root themselves. Another quiet thing happens as generations pass. People start inheriting expectations instead of instructions. No one says, "This is how you do it." They say, "This is how evenings go." They pass down timing, not technique. After work, after prayer, after the animals are fed, after the noise fades, the plant becomes secondary. What matters is the pause. And because the pause already exists, the plant never needs to justify itself. It simply fills space that was already there. That's why it's so often misunderstood later. Observers focus on the object, the smoke, the smell, the tool, but users are focused on the gap it fills. And gaps don't show up in records. No one writes about the minutes between tasks. They write about the tasks, which makes it look, from the outside, like cannabis suddenly appears out of nowhere, as if people just decided one day to start altering themselves. But from the inside, nothing new happened. The evening just unfolded the way it always had. Fire, rest, quiet. Over time, different societies try to formalize that quiet. They build spaces for it, cafes, courtyards, gathering rooms. Some of these spaces welcome smoke, some tolerate it, some forbid it loudly, but even when forbidden, the behavior doesn't disappear. It just migrates to rooftops, to back rooms, to edges where rules blur. Edges are comfortable places for habits. They offer flexibility. They allow contradiction. And contradiction is where humans feel most honest. People can believe something is wrong and still do it. Believe something is sacred and still hide it. Cannabis fits into that contradiction easily. It doesn't demand moral clarity. It functions without it. That's unsettling to systems that prefer clean categories. Good or bad, legal or illegal, sacred or profane. Cannabis refuses to stay in one box. So societies keep trying to push it into one, and every time they do, it slips sideways, becoming something else. Medicine, vice, tradition, threat, never just itself. But the people using it rarely change their relationship to it. They don't suddenly believe it's powerful because someone said so. They don't suddenly fear it because someone warned them. They continue to experience it the same quiet way they always have, as something that slows the world just enough. That consistency is its real strength, not potency, predictability, knowing roughly how an evening will end, knowing the body will settle, knowing the mind will stop racing for a while. That's not dramatic. It's dependable. Dependable things don't generate legends. They generate routines. And routines are harder to break than beliefs. This is why every attempt to frame cannabis as a sudden cultural rupture fails. Because it wasn't a rupture, it was seepage, a slow movement into spaces that already needed something to soften them. And those spaces are eternal. Night doesn't go away. Fatigue doesn't go away. Waiting doesn't go away. So neither does the habit that learned how to live inside them, even when tools change, even when names change, even when stories get louder. Underneath all of that, the same small moment keeps repeating. Someone decides they don't need to rush. Someone decides they don't need to be sharp. Someone lets the evening stretch. And that decision, repeated enough times, becomes history without ever meaning to. And there's a quiet irony hiding in how familiar this all feels. Because the more ordinary the habit becomes, the harder it is for people to remember that it was ever noticed. At some point, cannabis stops being something people talk about and becomes something they talk around. They mention the evening, they mention the fire, they mention the long silence. They don't mention the smoke, not because it's secret, because it's assumed. Assumed things don't get explained, they get absorbed. And absorption is how behaviors pass through generations without instructions. Children watch adults sit. They notice when evenings slow. They notice when voices soften. No one says why. And children don't ask. They just store the pattern. Much later, when they repeat it, it feels familiar without being remembered. That's one of the strangest things about human habits. They can feel ancient without feeling taught, which is why arguments about origins always feel slightly misplaced. You can't point to the beginning of something that seeped in gradually. It's like asking when people started leaning back in chairs, or when silence started feeling heavy. The behavior emerges when conditions allow it, and conditions have always allowed for smoke. Another thing that helps this habit persist is how forgiving it is. It doesn't require precision. It doesn't punish inconsistency. You can stop for years and return without relearning anything. You can change the tool, change the setting, change the reason, and it still works the same way. That kind of forgiveness is rare. Most habits demand maintenance. Cannabis just waits. Waiting again. Always waiting. That waiting quality makes it strangely patient with judgment. People condemn it loudly, then forget about it, then rediscover it, then condemn it again. The habit doesn't respond. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't defend itself. It just continues doing what it has always done when someone sits down long enough. This frustrates systems that want reactions, that want escalation. But patience doesn't play that game, which is why, historically, moments of panic always fade. Laws get written, speeches get made, enforcement spikes, and then life resumes. People still get tired, still get bored, still get stuck in long evenings, and when the noise fades, the habit is still there, waiting quietly where it always waits. In the gap between effort and rest, in the space after work but before sleep, in the moment where no one is watching closely. Those moments multiply. They always do, because life keeps producing them. And cannabis doesn't need promotion to survive there. It doesn't compete. It doesn't advertise. It simply occupies. That occupation is subtle enough to feel invisible until someone decides to look directly at it. And when they do, they're often surprised by how unremarkable it is. No dramatic transformation, no clear moral lesson, just a slight softening, a slight delay, a willingness to stay where you are a little longer, which is not the kind of effect history usually records. History prefers turning points, revolutions, beginnings and ends. This habit offers none of that. It exists in the middle, and the middle is where most people live. That's why it keeps returning in different forms, different names, different tools, but the same posture, the same decision to sit instead of move, the same breath drawn a little deeper than necessary, the same acceptance that the night will take as long as it takes. And that acceptance, that surrender to duration, is older than any date we could assign to it. So when the question keeps coming back, when did people start smoking weed? It keeps dissolving, because the habit doesn't belong to a moment. It belongs to a feeling, and feelings don't begin cleanly. They accumulate, they linger, they wait, just like smoke. And there's another small detail that keeps returning, no matter the century or the place. The way people arrive at the moment, they don't rush into it. They don't plan for it all day. It usually happens after something ends, after the tools are put away, after the door is closed, after the last task stops demanding attention. Cannabis slips into those after moments. The moments that don't belong to anyone. No supervisor, no elder, no schedule. Just time that hasn't decided what it wants yet. That's important, because habits that live in undecided time are very hard to dislodge. They don't interrupt anything official. They don't compete with obligations. They wait until obligations loosen their grip. And obligations always do. Another thing that helps this habit persist is how gently it scales. It works in silence. It works in company. It works when people talk. It works when no one wants to. It doesn't insist on mood. It adapts to it. If the evening is heavy, it settles it. If the evening is light, it stretches it. That flexibility is subtle. But subtle advantages last longer than dramatic ones. Dramatic things burn bright and fade. Subtle things just remain. That's why cannabis rarely feels like a turning point in people's lives. It doesn't announce a before and after. It just slightly alters the texture of the same day. And texture is something humans notice only when it's gone. So people rarely realize how much they rely on it until they're asked to stop. That's when the questions start. Why do I miss it? What was it doing for me? And the answers are usually frustratingly vague. It helped. It made things easier. It took the edge off. Edges are interesting. They're where pressure builds. And pressure looks different depending on who you are. For some, it's physical exhaustion. For others, it's repetition. For others, it's silence that feels too loud. Cannabis doesn't fix any of that. It just makes the edges less sharp. And dull edges don't demand immediate action. That's why people can sit longer, listen longer, wait longer. Waiting keeps coming back in this story because it's unavoidable. Even modern life, loud as it is, still contains waiting. Waiting in rooms, waiting for responses, waiting for the day to be over. The tools have changed. The need hasn't. And cannabis has always been good at living in need without becoming the center of it. It doesn't replace meaning. It fills gaps where meaning isn't required. That makes it less threatening than things that promise transformation, but also harder to justify removing. You can argue against ideologies. You can fight movements. But how do you fight a pause? How do you outlaw someone choosing to sit quietly? So societies try indirect routes. They regulate the object. They regulate the tool. They regulate the place. They never quite regulate the moment. Because moments don't belong to anyone. And moments are where this habit feels most at home. Even when people feel watched, they find ways to recreate the moment. A shorter pause, a later hour, a quieter space. The habit shrinks and stretches to fit whatever space is available. Like smoke itself, too much pressure and it slips through cracks, too little and it lingers comfortably. This adaptability is often mistaken for resilience, but it's more like humility. Cannabis doesn't insist on being noticed. It's fine with partial presence. That's why it survives cycles of fascination and fear. One era discovers it and talks endlessly. Another gets bored and looks away. Through all of that, people continue to sit, continue to breathe, continue to let time loosen its grip, just a little. And those little loosenings accumulate, not into revolutions, into evenings, thousands of them, millions, probably, none remarkable on their own. But together they form something continuous, a long, unbroken habit of not rushing when rushing isn't required. That's not a cultural movement, that's a human one, and it explains more than dates ever could. Because dates suggest beginnings, and this story doesn't really have one. It has repetition, it has return, it has the same small decision made again and again by people who never thought they were participating in history. They were just trying to get through the night. And this is usually where something subtle changes. Not in the habit itself, in the way people notice it. Up until now, everything we've talked about could disappear into the background of life. Smoke, fire, waiting, evening. But eventually, someone starts paying attention. Not out of curiosity, out of irritation. Because habits don't become problems when they exist. They become problems when they interfere. And cannabis doesn't interfere with much until life starts demanding more precision, longer hours, stricter routines, clearer hierarchies. That's when a pause stops looking neutral. It starts looking defiant, not because anyone intends it to be, but because the world around it has sped up. And here's the part most people miss. Cannabis doesn't change much over time. What changes is how much stillness society can tolerate. In slower worlds, a long pause is normal. In faster ones, it feels suspicious. So the same behavior suddenly looks different. Someone sitting quietly used to look tired. Now it looks unmotivated. Someone slowing down used to look human. Now it looks like resistance. And resistance attracts attention. That attention brings language, labels, stories, warnings. This is where the habit starts to acquire a reputation it never asked for. Before this, it didn't need defending. No one cared enough. But once it's noticed, people start speaking about it instead of around it. That's a big shift. Because when people speak around something, it stays flexible. When they speak about it, they try to fix it in place. And fixing a habit in place almost always distorts it. People exaggerate its effects. Others minimize them. Some turn it into a moral failure. Others turn it into a sacred tool. Both sides miss something important. The habit was never trying to be important. It was trying to be useful. Useful to people whose days were too long, whose nights were too empty, whose thoughts didn't know where to rest. That usefulness doesn't disappear just because someone starts watching. It just adapts. People become quieter about it, more selective, more careful about when and where. The habit learns new manners. This is where tools become interesting, because tools reflect pressure. When smoking is easy, tools are simple. When it's watched, tools become discreet, smaller, quieter, easier to hide. Not because the habit changed, because the environment did. And humans are very good at adjusting habits without consciously noticing they're doing it. They don't say, I must adapt. They say, this works better now. That sentence has carried cannabis through centuries, through shifts in power, through moral panics, through attempts at control. Not because anyone was planning long-term survival, because people always choose what works tonight. Tonight is a powerful unit of time. It doesn't care about history. It doesn't care about policy. It cares about how the body feels right now, how the mind sounds when it gets quiet. And cannabis has always spoken fluently to that moment. That's why, no matter how many times it's reframed as new or foreign or dangerous, it never feels unfamiliar to the people using it. They don't experience it as disruption. They experience it as recognition, like something they've known before, even if they can't say when, especially if they can't say when. That uncertainty creates intimacy, because things without clear beginnings feel personal. They feel discovered, not inherited. And discovery is exciting, even when it's quiet. So the habit continues, not loudly, not proudly, just consistently. And consistency is what keeps people listening, because once the listener realizes this isn't going anywhere fast, they relax. They stop waiting for a payoff. They settle into the rhythm, and rhythm is retention. Rhythm tells the brain, you're safe here. Nothing sudden is coming, which is exactly when people stay the longest. And once a habit is noticed, something almost always follows. Someone tries to explain it, not to understand it, to make it manageable. Explanations are a way of shrinking things that feel too loose. So people start saying what cannabis does. They say it slows you down, or opens your mind, or dulls your ambition, or makes you laugh at the wrong time. All of these explanations sound confident. None of them feel complete. Because explanations talk about the habit, but the habit lives inside the moment. And moments don't listen very well to explanations. This is where things start to fracture a little. The people who experience the habit one way hear it described another way, and that mismatch creates tension. Someone says, it makes you lazy, while the person listening remembers staying awake all night, alert, patient, steady. Someone says, it makes you careless, while the person listening remembers being very careful about everything. These contradictions pile up quietly. They don't explode. They just sit there, unresolved. And unresolved things are uncomfortable for systems. Systems want clarity. They want categories. They want to know whether something belongs or doesn't. Cannabis refuses to answer cleanly. It doesn't behave the same way in every body, or every evening, or every situation. That variability makes it slippery. And slippery things invite control attempts. Rules begin to appear, not always written, sometimes spoken, sometimes implied. Rules about who can use it, when, where. Rules that are often inconsistent, because the habit itself is inconsistent. It bends with mood, with fatigue, with context, so the rules never quite fit. And when rules don't fit, people learn to move around them, not rebelliously. Practically, they don't think of it as breaking rules. They think of it as restoring balance. That word balance comes up again and again when people talk quietly about why they return to it. Balance between noise and silence, between effort and rest, between thinking and stopping. Balance is not dramatic, which is why it's rarely celebrated, but it's deeply motivating. People will quietly protect anything that helps them feel balanced, even if they don't defend it out loud, even if they don't fully understand it themselves. This quiet protection is what allows the habit to survive changes in leadership, culture, and belief. It doesn't attach itself to any one story. So when one story fails, it simply slips into another. If it's framed as medicine, it lives there for a while. If it's framed as vice, it hides and waits. If it's framed as tradition, it settles in. It never insists on a single identity, which makes it difficult to eliminate. You can attack identities. You can dismantle narratives. But how do you remove something that doesn't claim to be anything specific? Something that just happens when people sit down long enough. This is where humor quietly lives. Because from the outside, the arguments look intense, urgent, moral, and from the inside, the habit looks almost boring. Someone sitting, someone breathing, someone letting a thought trail off without finishing it. That contrast never stops being a little absurd. The louder the argument becomes, the quieter the habit feels, which is backwards from how power usually works. Usually, the loudest thing wins. Here, the quiet thing outlasts. Because it doesn't need to win, it just needs to continue. And continuation is easier than conquest, especially when no one notices it happening. As time goes on, the habit accumulates stories without collecting a single truth. Different cultures explain it differently. Different generations interpret it through their own anxieties. But the physical act remains simple. Inhale, pause, exhale. That rhythm hasn't changed much. And rhythms are hardwired. They calm, they repeat, they signal safety, which is why once someone gets used to that rhythm, it becomes familiar very quickly. Too quickly sometimes. So quickly that they forget what it was like before. And forgetting is dangerous to rules. Because rules rely on memory. Memory of consequences. Memory of warnings. Memory of why something is forbidden. Habits that erase sharp memory make enforcement harder. Not because people are defiant, because they're comfortable. Comfort dulls urgency, and urgency is what power depends on. So the tension grows, not explosively, gradually, a slow tightening between a world that wants motion and a habit that offers pause. That tension doesn't resolve, it just shifts locations. It moves from public spaces to private ones, from daylight to night, from groups to individuals. The habit shrinks its footprint without shrinking itself. And that adaptability is misunderstood as weakness. But it's actually precision, knowing exactly how much space you need and no more. That's why this habit feels ancient, even when it's treated as new. It has learned, over a very long time, how to take up just enough room to survive. No banners, no declarations, just a small pocket of stillness. And as long as people keep needing that pocket, the habit keeps finding it. And eventually, something almost invisible happens. People stop thinking of the habit as something they do and start thinking of it as something that simply happens. Like dusk. No one causes dusk. No one schedules it. It arrives when conditions are right. Cannabis slips into life the same way. Not planned, not announced, just present. This is why so many people struggle to describe their relationship with it. They don't remember choosing it. They remember noticing that the evening felt different once it was there. That difference didn't demand explanation. It didn't even demand attention. It just made staying feel easier than leaving. And staying is something humans crave more than they admit. Staying in a chair, staying in a conversation, staying inside a moment that isn't pushing them forward. Modern life rarely rewards staying. It rewards movement, progress, urgency, which makes staying feel quietly rebellious, even when it isn't intended to be. That unintended rebellion is what gives the habit a sharper edge later on, not because it changed, because the world around it did. As societies begin to value speed more aggressively, any practice that slows time becomes suspicious. Pauses are reinterpreted as waste, silence as emptiness, stillness as lack. But humans don't stop needing those things just because they're rebranded. They find ways to keep them anyway, often privately, often quietly. Cannabis becomes one of several tools for reclaiming pause without asking permission. Not the only one, just one that happens to work consistently. That consistency matters, because when everything else feels unstable, predictable softness becomes valuable. And value attracts attention, which brings us back to the cycle. Attention leads to concern. Concern leads to explanation. Explanation leads to control. And control rarely understands what it's controlling. It sees the surface, the smoke, the posture, the delay. It doesn't see the pressure that made the pause necessary. So control efforts feel misaligned, too blunt, too late, and people respond the only way they know how. They adjust. They don't abandon the habit. They refine it. Shorter pauses, later hours, different places. The habit becomes quieter, more efficient, better at hiding, which ironically makes it last longer, because the less space it takes up, the harder it is to attack. This shrinking doesn't feel like loss to the people using it. It feels like optimization, finding the smallest possible moment where relief still happens. That's a very human skill. We're good at carving out comfort in tight spaces, between obligations, between rules, between expectations. Cannabis just happens to fit into those carved spaces very well. And because it fits, it stays. It doesn't try to expand. It doesn't try to convert. It waits, waiting again, always waiting, waiting for the night to thin out, waiting for the noise to settle, waiting for someone to decide they don't need to be sharp anymore. That decision doesn't feel political. It feels physical. A shoulder dropping, a breath deepening, a thought slowing down mid-sentence. Those are small things. But small things repeated enough times shape lives. Not dramatically, quietly, which is why this habit feels older than it is, and newer than it should. It's always being rediscovered, always being reinterpreted, always being framed as something else. And through all of that, it continues doing exactly what it has always done. It makes staying possible. Staying in the evening, staying with discomfort, staying with thoughts that don't need solving. That kind of staying doesn't make headlines, but it fills rooms. and rooms filled with quiet people last a long time, longer than arguments, longer than laws, longer than explanations. Which is why, when you zoom out far enough, the question starts to lose its shape. When did people start smoking weed? Because from this distance, it doesn't look like a beginning. It looks like a pattern of humans finding small ways to tolerate the weight of time and repeating them without asking for permission. And patterns like that don't end. They just keep folding themselves into new nights, new rooms, new pauses. And then there's the moment when people start mistaking the habit for the cause. They look at the pause and assume the pause created the person, instead of realizing the person needed the pause first. This happens a lot in history. We reverse the order because it feels cleaner. It's easier to say this made them slow than to admit they were already exhausted. Cannabis gets caught in that reversal constantly. Someone sees a still body and assumes the stillness came from smoke. They don't see the hours before it, the repetition, the waiting, the dull ache of doing the same thing again. So the story becomes simplified, and simplified stories spread faster than accurate ones. They're easier to repeat. They fit into warnings. They turn into slogans. But habits don't care about slogans. They care about conditions. And the conditions that invite cannabis never really disappear, only change their clothes. In one era, it's physical labor. In another, it's mental labor. In one place, it's isolation. In another, it's overstimulation. Different pressures, same need. That's why the habit keeps resurfacing in moments of transition. When people move from rural life to cities, from slow trades to timed shifts, from communal living to private rooms, transitions stretch people thin. They create gaps. And cannabis has always been good at settling into gaps. Not loudly, not proudly, just efficiently. There's also something deeply unambitious about it. It doesn't promise improvement. It doesn't offer a future. It doesn't even pretend to fix anything. It just makes the present more tolerable. That modesty is unusual. Most things people are told to consume promise transformation, become better, become sharper, become faster. Cannabis offers none of that. It offers less. Less urgency, less friction, less insistence. And sometimes less is exactly what someone needs, which makes it dangerous to systems built on more output, more speed, more engagement. Those systems don't know what to do with something that encourages people to stop striving, even briefly. So they frame it as a threat, not because it destroys productivity, but because it questions its importance. A person who is comfortable waiting is harder to rush, and rushing is how control usually operates. So the tension sharpens again, not enough to explode, enough to hum, a constant low-level discomfort between a world that wants motion and a habit that offers stillness. This hum becomes part of the background noise of modern life. Arguments repeat, warnings repeat, nothing resolves. And in the middle of that hum, the habit keeps doing the same quiet thing. It meets people where they already are, on the floor, on the steps, at the edge of the day. It doesn't pull them anywhere new. It doesn't demand loyalty. It doesn't require belief, which is why people return to it, even after deciding they shouldn't, even after saying they're done, even after long breaks, because returning doesn't feel like a failure. It feels like recognition, like sitting back into a chair you forgot was comfortable. That familiarity can be unsettling, especially when you're told it shouldn't exist. So people rationalize. They say it's occasional. They say it's temporary. They say it's just for now. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes it is just for now. But now has a way of repeating itself. Nights repeat. Fatigue repeats. Waiting repeats. And every repetition is an invitation. Not a command, an invitation to pause. Which is why this habit doesn't need convincing. It doesn't argue. It doesn't persuade. It just shows up when the lights are low and the day has stopped asking questions. And people, being people, often accept the invitation without ceremony, without explanation, without thinking they're participating in anything larger than themselves. They're not thinking about history. They're thinking about getting through the next stretch of time without feeling scraped raw by it. And that motive, that quiet motive, is what carries the habit forward. Not culture, not rebellion, not tradition, just the very human desire to make time feel a little less sharp. And that desire isn't going anywhere. So neither does the habit that learned how to answer it. And there's a point where the habit stops being something people notice at all. It becomes background noise, like the sound of insects at night, always there, only obvious when it's gone. That's usually when a generation grows up, assuming the pause is part of life itself. Not something added, not something chosen, just something that happens when the day finally lets go. They don't think of it as smoking weed. They think of it as evening behavior, and evening behavior is rarely questioned. It's informal, unwritten, protected by its vagueness. That protection matters, because things that don't feel formal don't attract formal responses. They slip under laws, under debates, under attention, and that's exactly where this habit likes to live. Under language, under judgment, under definition. The more you try to pull it into the light, the more it seems to change shape, which makes people believe it's unpredictable. But it's not. It's actually very consistent. It appears when effort ends, when tension releases, when the body no longer needs to perform. That's not chaos. That's timing. And timing is everything. Another detail people overlook is how rarely this habit feels urgent. No one panics if they miss it. No one collapses without it, which makes it easy to dismiss. But ease is deceptive, because habits that don't demand urgency integrate quietly. They don't fight for space. They just wait until space opens. And space always opens eventually, especially in lives that are tightly packed. That's why this habit reappears most clearly during moments of compression. Urbanization, industrial schedules, digital overload. The tighter life becomes, the more valuable softness feels. Not luxury, softness, a way to let the mind rest without sleeping, a way to be awake without being sharp. That middle state is rare, and rare states get revisited, again and again. This is also where misunderstanding deepens. Observers look for intensity. They expect drama. They expect loss of control. But what they usually find is restraint. People sitting still, talking slowly, listening longer than usual. None of that fits the narrative of danger. So new narratives get invented, exaggerated, distorted, detached from lived experience. And those narratives circulate loudly, while the habit continues quietly. The gap between story and reality widens, and in that gap, humor lives. Because there's something faintly absurd about arguing passionately over a behavior that mostly involves people doing less. Less talking, less moving, less rushing. It's hard to fear something that encourages stillness, unless stillness itself feels threatening, and for societies built on momentum, it often does. Momentum needs friction to justify itself. Anything that reduces friction looks like resistance, even if it's gentle, especially if it's gentle. So the cycle continues. Attention, concern, control, adaptation, over and over. And each time, the habit sheds a little visibility, a little volume. It becomes smaller, quieter, better at fitting into cracks, until it's once again invisible enough to be tolerated. And tolerance is all it ever really needed. Not approval, just tolerance. That's why the habit survives periods of intense hostility, because hostility burns hot and fast. Tolerance burns low and long, and cannabis has always favored low heat, low light, low expectations, which makes it durable. Durable things don't need defending. They outlast, they wait, they return when pressure lifts, which it always does, eventually. Even the most rigid systems loosen at night. Guards get tired, rules blur, time stretches, and that stretch creates room for small behaviors to reassert themselves. Not loudly, not defiantly, just by being there, by offering a pause when nothing else does. And people accept. They always have. Not because they're rebellious, because they're human. And humans, when given the choice between constant sharpness and occasional softness, tend to choose softness. Again and again, until it feels normal, until it feels expected, until someone asks, much later, when it all started. And by then, the answer is buried under so many evenings that it barely matters. Because the habit isn't anchored to a beginning, it's anchored to a need. And that need doesn't move forward. It circles, just like this story. Fire, night, waiting, always waiting. And there's a moment quiet, almost forgettable, when the habit stops being something people notice after the fact and becomes something they anticipate without admitting it. Not consciously, just a soft expectation sitting somewhere behind the day, like knowing there will be a chair at the end of a long walk, like knowing the lights will be dimmer later. No one says it out loud. They don't mark it on calendars. They just move through the day with a little less resistance, because something softer is waiting on the other side of effort. That expectation is subtle, but subtle expectations shape behavior more reliably than rules. Rules demand attention. Expectations quietly guide movement. And this expectation doesn't ask much. It doesn't promise joy. It doesn't guarantee relief. It just suggests that the edge won't be as sharp later. That suggestion is enough, especially for people whose lives are defined by repetition. Repetition dulls excitement, but it sharpens fatigue. Cannabis doesn't counter repetition. It sits alongside it, like a rhythm that doesn't break the pattern, just slows it enough to be tolerable. This is why the habit doesn't announce itself as rebellion. Rebellion is loud. This is patient. Patient with routine. Patient with monotony. Patient with the fact that tomorrow will probably look a lot like today. That patience gets mistaken for passivity, but it isn't. It's strategic. It allows people to endure without burning out completely. And endurance is a skill societies often rely on, while quietly discouraging the tools that make it possible. There's an irony there. Endurance is praised. The means of achieving it are questioned. So people learn to separate the two. They don't talk about how they get through things. They just get through them. And that silence protects the habit again. Because things that aren't discussed aren't easily targeted. Another layer quietly forms around this time. Memory. not personal memory, cultural memory, stories passed indirectly, jokes, references, assumptions. Someone mentions the evening, and everyone knows what kind. Someone mentions the pause, and no one asks which one. Language develops gaps where meaning lives without being named. Cannabis thrives in those gaps. It doesn't need to be spoken, it's understood. Understanding without articulation is powerful. It bypasses argument. It bypasses debate. It lives beneath them. This is also when the habit starts to feel oddly timeless, not ancient, timeless, as if it belongs to no specific era, because it adapts just enough to never feel out of place. In slower times, it stretches time further. In faster times, it resists acceleration. In both cases, it offers the same thing, a permission slip to stop pushing for a moment. That permission is rarely given by institutions. It's given quietly, peer to peer. Someone hands something over. Someone nods. No explanation. Those exchanges don't show up in records. They show up in posture, in how people sit, how they breathe, how long they stay. And posture is history's blind spot. You can archive laws, you can date artifacts, you can catalogue speeches, but you can't easily document how long someone sat still and felt okay doing it. That's why this habit keeps slipping past historians. It doesn't leave sharp edges, it leaves softened ones. And softened edges don't cut through timelines, they blur them. Which brings us back to the question that keeps hovering. When did people start smoking weed? At this point, it almost feels beside the point. Because what we're really talking about is when people learned that time could be treated gently. And that lesson doesn't have a date. It has a rhythm. Work, pause, rest, repeat. Cannabis just learned how to live inside that rhythm without asking to be the center of it. And that humility is why it survives attention, why it outlasts fear, why it keeps returning after every attempt to define it too narrowly. It refuses to be just one thing, just like the people who use it. They're not trying to escape life. They're trying to make room inside it. Room to breathe, room to sit, room to let a thought fade without replacing it immediately. That kind of room is rare. And when something helps create it, people remember. Even if they don't remember when it started, especially if they don't. And eventually, the habit starts asking a quiet question, not out loud, just through inconvenience. Smoke is useful, but it's messy. It gets in the eyes. It burns the throat. It fills rooms, whether you want it to or not. At first, that messiness is part of the experience. No one expects comfort. Life isn't comfortable, but over time, people get tired of coughing. They get tired of ash drifting where it shouldn't. They get tired of losing half the smoke to the ceiling. So they start adjusting things, not to improve the habit, to contain it. Containment is always framed as control later on, but at the beginning, it's just practicality. Someone doesn't want sparks on their clothes. Someone doesn't want to stand the whole time. Someone wants the smoke closer and steadier. So they put it somewhere, a hollow, a bowl, a carved space, not to change the experience, to make it manageable. That's how tools are born, not from vision, from irritation. And irritation is a powerful motivator. The first tools don't feel like inventions. They feel like fixes, temporary fixes. Someone thinks, this will do for now. And for now, has a habit of lasting centuries. Once the smoke is contained, something subtle shifts. It becomes directional. Instead of filling everything, it goes somewhere specific, toward a face, toward a mouth, toward a single person. This is a quiet turning point, not historically dramatic, but experientially significant, because now the pause belongs to someone, not everyone. And when something belongs to one person instead of a group, it starts to feel personal. Privacy enters the picture. Privacy changes behavior. People become quieter, more attentive, more aware of timing. The habit doesn't need a whole room anymore. It needs a corner, and corners are easier to protect than rooms. This is where smoking starts to feel less like atmosphere and more like choice. Not because it suddenly becomes intentional, but because it becomes contained. Containment makes things noticeable, and noticeability attracts judgment. But before judgment arrives, something else happens. Refinement. People notice differences. Some smoke feels heavier. Some feels lighter. Some lingers. Some passes quickly. They don't analyze it. They just adjust. They choose certain materials, certain preparations, certain ways of holding the tool. This isn't science. It's familiarity, the kind you develop by doing the same small thing over and over. Bodies learn faster than minds. Hands remember angles. Lungs remember rhythm. This is where the habit deepens without expanding. It becomes more precise, more predictable, and predictability is comforting, especially in lives that offer very little of it. But predictability also makes behavior easier to spot. From the outside, someone always sitting the same way, at the same time, in the same place. Patterns are visible, and visible patterns make people curious or suspicious, often both. This is when the room starts to matter. Enclosed spaces hold smoke. They intensify it, they slow it down, and they amplify everything else too. Voices sound closer. Thoughts feel louder. Time stretches further. Rooms do half the work. They turn a small act into a larger experience, which is why smoking indoors becomes such a focal point later. Not because it's more dangerous, because it's harder to ignore. A room filled with smoke feels intentional, even if it wasn't meant to be. So people start associating the habit with spaces, certain rooms, certain times, certain people. It stops being everywhere. It becomes somewhere. And once something has a place, it can be regulated, or at least attempted. But before rules arrive, there's a long stretch of quiet normalization. People learn where it's welcome, where it's tolerated, where it's better not to linger. These rules aren't written, they're felt. Someone clears their throat, someone opens a door, someone looks away. That's usually enough. The habit adapts. It always does. It becomes quieter, more polite, less intrusive, not because it's ashamed, because it wants to stay. Staying is the real goal, not expression, not rebellion, just continuity. And continuity requires awareness. Awareness of space, of timing, of who's around. So the habit becomes socially intelligent. It learns when to appear and when to wait. Waiting again, always waiting. That waiting is easier now because tools allow it to be postponed. You don't need a fire anymore. You don't need a group. You just need the moment to open, and moments always open eventually, especially at night. Night forgives a lot. Low light hides details. Silence absorbs pauses. Night makes stillness feel appropriate. which is why so much of this habit settles there, not by rule, by comfort. And comfort is persuasive without being loud. This is where the habit feels most settled. Not exciting, not transgressive, just in place, which is exactly when societies begin to notice it most clearly, because things feel most permanent right before someone tries to move them. And when something starts to feel in place, people begin to react to it differently. They don't react with curiosity anymore. They react with expectations. Someone notices the room smells a certain way and assumes what's happening. Someone sees the posture and fills in the rest. Someone hears the quiet and decides what it must mean. Assumptions arrive long before rules do, and assumptions are heavier because they don't need enforcement. They operate silently. People start adjusting themselves before anyone tells them to. They close doors sooner. They choose later hours. They sit farther from windows, not because they're afraid, because they understand how attention works. Attention rarely arrives politely. It arrives with opinions attached. So the habit learns discretion, not secrecy. Discretion, there's a difference. Secrecy hides something. Discretion places it carefully. That's an important evolution, because once a habit becomes discreet, it becomes durable. It stops clashing with its environment. It fits into it, and fitting in is more effective than pushing back. This is where the habit starts to feel almost civilized. It develops manners, unspoken ones, when to stop, when to share, when to pause. Those manners don't come from law. They come from repetition inside social space. People learn quickly what makes others uncomfortable, and they adjust just enough to avoid friction. That adjustment keeps the habit alive without making it loud. Loud habits burn out. Quiet ones linger. This quiet persistence creates another misunderstanding later. Observers think the habit must be new because they're only just noticing it. They don't realize it's been there the whole time, just better behaved, better positioned, better at not demanding attention, which leads to a familiar cycle. Discovery, concern, debate. Someone asks, when did this start? As if it hasn't been unfolding slowly in the background for years. Sometimes decades. Sometimes centuries. The question itself reveals the blindness. Because people only ask about beginnings when something feels out of control. And what feels out of control is rarely what actually is. It's usually just unfamiliar or newly visible. Visibility has consequences. Once something is seen clearly, it gets interpreted loudly. People attach meanings that don't come from experience. They project fears. They project hopes. They project anxieties that have very little to do with smoke. The habit becomes a screen. People argue about it instead of what's underneath. Fatigue, isolation, pressure, those are harder to confront. So the argument stays on the surface, and the habit stays underneath, doing the same quiet thing, offering pause, offering tolerance, offering a way to sit with time without fighting it. As the world grows more structured, this contrast sharpens. Schedules tighten, expectations rise, time fragments, moments become shorter, attention becomes currency, and anything that encourages lingering starts to feel inefficient, which makes it suspicious. But suspicion doesn't erase desire. It just teaches it new routes. The habit adapts again. It becomes more portable, more compact, more private. Not because it wants to spread, because it wants to survive. Survival favors flexibility, and flexibility has always been its strength. Not potency, not intensity, adaptability. That adaptability is why it keeps reappearing across different lives that have nothing else in common. Different cultures, different beliefs, different values, same fatigue, same need for a pause that doesn't require explanation. And explanation is exhausting. Explaining why you need rest, explaining why you want quiet, explaining why you're not rushing. Cannabis never asks for explanation. It doesn't require justification. It doesn't argue its case, which is why people return to it even when they feel conflicted about it. Conflict belongs to the mind. The body knows what it needs, and the body usually wins in the long run. That's another uncomfortable truth. Most habits survive not because they make sense, but because they feel right. Not morally right, physically right. Like loosening a grip you didn't realize you were holding. That sensation is hard to legislate against, hard to argue with, hard to replace. So the habit continues. Smaller, quieter, better integrated. It stops being a topic and returns to being a background condition until the cycle repeats, until someone notices again and asks again and wonders again when it all began, as if beginnings were ever the important part, when the real story has always been about endurance, about finding ways to stay present without being worn down by it, about learning how to sit inside time instead of constantly pushing through it. That's what this habit learned early, and it hasn't forgotten. And the first problems don't arrive loudly. They never do. They arrive as awkward moments. Small ones. The kind people don't report. They just remember. Someone sits a little too long when they should stand. Someone laughs a little too late when the room has already gone quiet. Someone answers a question that wasn't meant for them. Nothing dramatic, just off. That's usually how trouble begins. Not with danger, with discomfort. The first time someone notices, it's usually framed as a mistake. Too much smoke, wrong timing, bad idea tonight. No one blames the habit yet. They blame the moment. And that's important, because as long as the problem feels situational, the habit stays innocent. People adjust. They say, not here, or not before this, or only after everything's done. These aren't rules, they're negotiations. And negotiations are signs of integration. You don't negotiate with something you don't plan to keep. You negotiate with something you want to make room for. So people make room quietly, but rooms have boundaries. And sometimes someone crosses one without meaning to. That's when embarrassment enters the story. Embarrassment is powerful, more powerful than fear. Fear makes people defensive. Embarrassment makes them careful. Someone realizes they spoke too slowly, or forgot what they were saying halfway through a sentence, or stared at the fire just a little too long. And someone else noticed, not angry, just watching. That look stays with people longer than any warning. So they recalibrate. Less smoke, later hour, different place. This is how social intelligence forms around a habit. Not through lectures, through glances. And those glances do more shaping than laws ever will. Another kind of trouble appears when timing collides with responsibility. Someone smokes before something that requires precision. A watch, a task, a decision, and suddenly the pause feels misaligned. Not wrong, just misplaced. This creates a subtle distinction. Not don't do it, just don't do it then. And distinctions like that are how habits survive scrutiny. They learn boundaries. They learn context. They learn restraint. That restraint is often mistaken later for hypocrisy. But it isn't. It's adaptation. The habit learns when it's welcome and when it isn't, which makes it less disruptive and more durable. There's also the moment when humor turns slightly sharp. Someone laughs when they shouldn't. Someone finds something funny that no one else does. And suddenly laughter feels exposed. Laughter reveals timing. It tells everyone where someone is mentally. And that visibility can feel dangerous. So people learn to laugh inward, or not at all. That adjustment matters because it marks the transition from carefree use to aware use. Awareness brings caution. Caution brings longevity. But awareness also brings stories. People start telling small anecdotes, not as warnings, as curiosities. Remember when? That time someone, you had to be there. These stories circulate quietly. They don't condemn, they contextualize. They teach without instructing. And teaching without instruction is the most effective kind. This is also when older generations begin to notice. Not because something new has appeared, but because something familiar has become visible in the wrong moment. Visibility always matters more than frequency. A behavior can exist for decades unnoticed until it appears in daylight, or in front of the wrong person, or in the middle of something important. That's when concern wakes up. Concern doesn't arrive with facts. It arrives with tone, a pause in conversation, a tightened jaw, a question asked twice. Are you all right? That question carries weight. It implies misalignment, and misalignment invites correction. Not immediately, but eventually. At first, correction is informal. Advice, warnings, concerned looks. Only later does it become official. But by then, the habit has already learned how to shrink, how to fold itself inward, how to take up less space. That shrinking is crucial because it prevents escalation. It keeps trouble small, contained, manageable. And manageable problems don't inspire drastic action. They inspire tolerance. Tolerance is the sweet spot. It allows a habit to exist without demanding approval, just silence. And silence, for a long time, is enough. So the first troubles don't end the habit. They refine it. They teach it manners. They teach it timing. They teach it how to stay. And staying is the real victory here. Not dominance, not acceptance, just continuation. Which is why, after the first awkward moments fade into stories, the habit doesn't disappear. It settles, quieter, smarter, more careful. And that carefulness is exactly what allows it to survive the much louder troubles that come later. The official ones, the written ones, the ones that arrive after people have already learned how to adapt. And after those first small troubles pass, something important becomes clear. The habit doesn't disappear when it causes friction. It reorganizes. That's the pattern. People don't abandon it. They relocate it. They move it later into the night. They move it deeper indoors. They move it closer to people they trust. And trust becomes part of the habit. Not trust in the plant. Trust in the moment. Who's here? Who isn't? Who understands the pause without asking questions? This is where the habit stops being casual, not serious. Selective. Selective habits last longer than casual ones. Casual habits get sloppy. Selective ones learn precision. And precision changes everything. Now the smoke isn't everywhere. It's somewhere. Now the time isn't random. It's chosen. Now the act isn't accidental. It's anticipated. Not loudly, quietly. That quiet anticipation adds weight. Not dramatic weight. Social weight. People start associating the habit with certain kinds of evenings. Evenings that don't involve guests. Evenings without obligations the next morning. Evenings that belong only to the people present. That association matters because it creates boundaries, and boundaries protect habits. Without boundaries, everything spills. With boundaries, things stay contained. This is also when tools evolve more noticeably, not because people want stronger effects, because they want consistency. Consistency is comforting. A predictable pause, a predictable duration, a predictable feeling of settling. People learn how much is enough, not scientifically, experientially. Too little does nothing. Too much disrupts the balance. Balance becomes the goal, not escape, not intensity. Balance. This is where a lot of later misunderstandings originate. Outsiders assume people are chasing extremes. They don't see the careful calibration, the adjustments, the restraint. They don't see how often people stop themselves, how often they say, "Not tonight," or "That's enough." Those moments don't get recorded, but they shape the habit more than excess ever does. As the habit becomes more precise, it also becomes more private. Privacy creates intimacy, and intimacy creates meaning. Not ideological meaning, personal meaning, a sense that this moment belongs to us. Not the world, not authority, just the people in the room. That exclusivity makes the habit feel protective, which is ironic, because it was never meant to protect anything. It just learned how to exist without interference. And that skill becomes crucial when attention intensifies. Because eventually, attention always does. Someone notices patterns. Certain people always leaving early. Certain rooms always closing doors. Certain evenings always stretching longer. Patterns invite interpretation. And interpretation invites judgment. That's when the questions start. Not scientific ones, social ones. Why do they always? What are they doing in there? Is that healthy? Health becomes a convenient frame. It sounds neutral, concerned, but it carries judgment quietly. Health implies correction, and correction implies authority. This is where the habit starts to be discussed about instead of experienced. Descriptions replace sensations. Assumptions replace familiarity. And once that shift happens, things accelerate. Stories spread faster. Warnings circulate. Someone hears about a bad experience that happened somewhere else, to someone else. The specifics don't matter. The impression does. And impressions travel faster than habits ever could. But impressions are fragile. They don't hold up well against lived experience. So people continue quietly. They just do it with more awareness, more discretion, more separation between private life and public appearance. This separation hardens over time, and that hardening makes the habit harder to access for outsiders, which reinforces suspicion. A feedback loop forms. Visibility creates concern. Concern creates discretion. Discretion creates mystery. Mystery creates fear. Fear then justifies control. And control arrives late. Always late. By the time rules appear, the habit has already adapted. It's smaller now, quieter, better hidden. Not hidden because it's ashamed. Hidden because it understands timing. This is where prohibition starts missing its target. It aims at visibility, but the habit no longer depends on visibility. It depends on moments. Moments are portable. Moments are hard to police, especially when they don't look dramatic, especially when they look like someone sitting quietly. That's the great irony. The more attention this habit receives, the less it resembles the exaggerated stories told about it. Instead of chaos, there's calm. Instead of rebellion, there's routine. Instead of disruption, there's withdrawal from noise. That mismatch confuses authorities. They expect consequences that don't materialize the way they imagined. So the narrative gets louder to compensate. More warnings, more emphasis, more urgency. But urgency doesn't align with the lived reality, which makes people distrust the message. And once trust erodes, rules lose their grip. Not completely, just enough. Enough for the habit to continue quietly beneath the surface, which is exactly where it has always thrived. This brings us to a subtle but important shift. At some point, people stop thinking of cannabis as the cause of the pause and start seeing it as a companion to it. The pause exists first. Cannabis arrives second. That order matters because you can't remove the pause without changing the structure of life itself. And no law has ever successfully done that. Life still produces fatigue, still produces waiting, still produces long evenings with nowhere to go. As long as those exist, something will move in to soften them. Cannabis just happened to get there early and learn how to stay. Which is why, when modern arguments flare up, they always feel strangely disconnected from history. They argue as if this habit suddenly appeared, as if it hasn't already survived every version of concern before. Concern from elders, concern from leaders, concern from institutions. Each one believed it was the first to notice. None of them were. They were just the loudest at the time. The habit waited them out. It always does, because waiting is what it knows best. And waiting doesn't get tired. People do, which is why, after every wave of attention fades, the habit is still there. Not triumphant, just present, ready to fill the same small space it has always filled, between effort and rest, between noise and silence, between one day and the next. And once discretion becomes second nature, something else quietly follows. Standardization, not official, not written, just shared understanding. People begin to recognize the right way to do it. Not morally right, practically right. The way that doesn't cause trouble. The way that doesn't draw attention. The way that fits into the evening instead of interrupting it. This is where tools stop being improvisations and start being companions. A certain shape feels better in the hand. A certain size feels appropriate for the time available. A certain rhythm feels familiar enough to relax into. None of this is announced. It's learned by watching, by noticing, by small corrections after small mistakes. Tools quietly shape behavior. They always do. Not by forcing it, by suggesting it. A tool that requires sitting encourages sitting. A tool that takes time encourages patience. A tool that works best indoors encourages privacy. And privacy changes tone. Voices lower. Movements slow. Conversations stretch. Rooms start to matter more than before. Not all rooms, specific ones. Rooms where interruptions are unlikely. Rooms where time doesn't feel measured. These rooms become associated with the habit, not officially, emotionally. You walk into them and expect a certain quiet, a certain softness, a certain pace. Expectation shapes experience. So even before anything happens, the body begins to settle. This is important because it means the habit isn't doing all the work anymore. The environment is participating. The room, the light, the time of day. Cannabis becomes part of a larger system of slowing down, which makes it harder to isolate as the problem. Is it the smoke, or the hour, or the exhaustion that led here? That ambiguity frustrates control. You can't regulate a feeling, you can only regulate objects. So objects become the target, the plant, the tool, the space. But the feeling slips through. It always does. This is where law eventually enters the story. Not as a solution, as a response. Law arrives after patterns have already formed, after habits have learned how to move, after discretion has become instinct, which is why law always feels slightly out of step. It's trying to stop something that has already adapted, so it aims broadly, sometimes clumsily, sometimes symbolically, and people respond the way they always do when rules misunderstand behavior. They comply outwardly and adjust inwardly. The habit doesn't confront, it sidesteps. It becomes smaller, later, more contained. It trades openness for longevity. That trade is almost always accepted, because openness was never the goal. Comfort was. This is where a strange calm settles over the whole situation. The loud arguments continue elsewhere, but on the ground, things stabilize. People know where and when not to push it. They know which moments are worth preserving and which aren't. That knowledge isn't rebellious. It's careful. Careful habits don't collapse easily. They survive by knowing their limits. And cannabis learns its limits very well. It doesn't insist on daylight. It doesn't insist on crowds. It doesn't insist on frequency. It waits for alignment. Alignment between fatigue and safety, between silence and time, between wanting to pause and being allowed to. When alignment isn't there, it recedes. When it is, it appears, quietly, predictably, which is why it shows up across so many different lives that otherwise share very little. Different beliefs, different backgrounds, different pressures, same alignment, same moment where the day finally loosens. This universality is often misread as cultural spread, but it's not about culture, it's about structure. Any life structured around effort will eventually produce a desire for softness. Any system that compresses time will create a longing for stretch. Cannabis doesn't create that longing, it answers it. Which is why, when people try to remove it without addressing the structure underneath, something else always fills the space. Another habit, another pause, another way to cope. The need doesn't vanish. It just changes costume. This is why the story keeps looping instead of resolving. Every attempt to define it tightly fails. Every attempt to contain it fully leaks. Not because the habit is powerful, because the conditions that invite it are persistent. And persistence beats intensity every time. Intensity flares and burns out. Persistence waits. Waits through arguments. Waits through reform. Waits through rediscovery. And eventually, attention drifts elsewhere. It always does. Something newer, something louder, something easier to point at. And in that drifting, the habit settles back into its familiar place. Not celebrated, not feared, just present. Present in the quiet after effort. present in the room where nothing urgent is happening, present in the stretch of time people don't know what to do with yet, which is where it has always lived most comfortably, not at the center of history, at the edges of evenings, and those edges are endless. They repeat every day, which means the habit never really needs to move forward. It just needs to be there when the day finally steps aside, and it almost always is. And after a while, something quietly flips. The habit stops adapting to the world, and the world starts adapting around it, not officially, not consciously, just in small, unnoticed ways. Rooms get arranged differently. Windows open more easily. Curtains get heavier. People choose seating that encourages staying. They place objects where they don't have to reach far. They learn how to dim a space without turning lights off completely. None of this is done for the habit. It's done for comfort. But comfort has consequences. Because once comfort becomes repeatable, it becomes expected. And expectations shape evenings. Someone finishes a task and already knows where they'll sit. Someone hears the quiet and knows it's time to slow down. Someone feels the body shift gears before the mind catches up. This is when the habit becomes embedded in routine. Not daily, not rigidly, but predictably enough to feel stable. Stability is seductive, especially in lives that feel unpredictable everywhere else. This is also where people start to misremember the past. They look back and assume things were always like this, that they've always ended days this way. Memory smooths rough edges. It erases the awkward beginnings, the coughing, the mistakes, the embarrassment. What remains is the familiar rhythm, and rhythms feel timeless. That's dangerous for arguments, because timeless things feel justified simply by existing. No one asks why the sun sets. No one asks why evenings feel slower. No one asks why sitting feels better than standing after a long day. Cannabis slips into that category. It stops feeling optional, not necessary, but natural. And natural things are hard to argue against without sounding artificial, which is why debates about it always feel strained. They try to introduce urgency into a behavior that feels unhurried. They try to inject fear into something associated with relief. That mismatch never quite works. So the language around it grows more extreme to compensate. Sharper warnings, bigger claims, stronger predictions, but the lived experience remains stubbornly mild, a little softer, a little slower, a little quieter. That gap between language and reality keeps widening. And in that gap, trust erodes. People start relying more on what they feel than on what they're told. Not because they're defiant, because experience is persuasive. And experience says this isn't dramatic, it's incremental. It doesn't change who you are. It changes how you sit with what already exists. That distinction matters because it reframes the habit from transformation to accommodation. And accommodation is rarely threatening. It's pragmatic. It's what people do when the world doesn't bend easily. They bend themselves slightly instead. Cannabis becomes one of those small bends, not enough to break anything, just enough to fit. This is also when people begin to separate the habit from identity. They don't think of themselves as smokers. They think of themselves as people who sometimes sit longer, people who sometimes let the night stretch. That separation is important. Identities can be attacked. Behaviors that don't claim identity are harder to confront. You can argue against labels. You can't easily argue against moments. Moments pass. They leave no trace. And the habit becomes a collection of moments rather than a lifestyle. which makes it easier to carry quietly, easier to put down, easier to pick up again. That flexibility protects it from extremes, from obsession, from collapse. It stays in the middle. The middle is where most humans operate best. Not too much, not too little, just enough. This just enough quality frustrates people looking for clear narratives. They want heroes or villains. They want cautionary tales or success stories. Cannabis offers neither. It offers a texture, a way time feels, and textures don't fit into headlines. They fit into evenings, which is why this habit keeps avoiding definitive endings. Every time it seems like it will be resolved, banned, embraced, defined, it simply changes how it appears. It becomes quieter, later, more selective, but never gone, because the needed answers isn't going anywhere. As long as people get tired, as long as days demand more than they give back, as long as silence sometimes feels too sharp to sit in unassisted, something will soften it. Cannabis just happens to have learned how to do that without asking for much in return. No belief, no loyalty, no declaration, just a moment. And moments repeat. That repetition is the real through line here. Not the plant, not the smoke, not the arguments. The repetition of evenings ending, of bodies settling, of minds letting go of the need to push forward. That's the rhythm everything else dances around. And that rhythm is older than any rule that tried to interrupt it. Which is why, even now, the habit doesn't feel finished. It feels ongoing, unresolved, still unfolding, because it's not a story with a climax. It's a pattern that keeps finding room to continue, quietly, patiently, right where people leave space for it. And eventually, the habit becomes so integrated that people stop checking in with it at all. They don't ask how it will feel tonight. They don't wonder if it will work the same way. They trust it. Trust is a strange thing. It doesn't come from perfection. It comes from predictability, knowing that whatever happens, the edges will soften a little. That trust doesn't announce itself. It just shows up as less resistance during the day. People push a little harder, knowing there's a pause later. They tolerate a little more noise, knowing silence is coming. This is one of the quiet ways habits reshape behavior long before anyone notices. The pause doesn't just affect the evening, it reaches backward into the day. That's when things start to feel slightly unsettling to outsiders. Because the effect isn't visible where they're looking, they see the sitting, they see the stillness. They don't see how much effort preceded it. So the habit looks unearned. And unearned calm makes people uncomfortable, especially in cultures where calm is supposed to be a reward, something you earn through productivity. Cannabis disrupts that logic gently. It offers calm without demanding proof of worth. That's radical in a very quiet way. Not enough to start movements, enough to irritate assumptions. And irritation is often the first step toward moralization. People start talking about deserving and undeserving pauses, about who should be allowed to rest and who shouldn't. The habit gets pulled into those conversations without consent. It becomes a symbol, and symbols are heavy. They carry expectations that have nothing to do with lived experience. This is where things start getting tangled, because people using the habit aren't trying to make statements. They're trying to make it through the night. But once something becomes symbolic, it's hard to keep it simple. Arguments inflate, edges sharpen. What was once about timing becomes about values, and values are exhausting. Most people don't want to argue values at the end of a long day. They want quiet, so they retreat further into discretion. The habit shrinks its footprint again. It becomes something done after conversations end, after phones are put down, after the last demand releases its grip. This shrinking looks like retreat from the outside, but from the inside, it feels like refinement, finding the smallest possible space where relief still happens. That's a skill people get very good at when they feel watched. And watched people learn how to disappear without leaving. Cannabis becomes something that exists in that disappearing space. Not secretive, just selective. Selective about who's present. Selective about when it shows itself. That selectivity creates a new layer of intimacy. Now the pause isn't just about time, it's about trust. Who you're willing to be quiet with. Who you're willing to slow down in front of. Those choices matter. They shape relationships. They shape social circles without anyone ever announcing it. This is how habits quietly influence social structure, not by organizing people, by filtering moments. People gravitate toward others who understand the pause, who don't rush to fill silence, who don't demand explanations. That gravitation isn't ideological. It's comfortable. Comfort tends to cluster, and clusters attract attention eventually, which restarts the cycle. People notice gatherings. They notice patterns. They notice similarities. And once again, the habit gets framed as the cause rather than the context, as if the pause created the people, instead of people creating space for the pause. That reversal never quite stops happening. It's too convenient. It simplifies complex human needs into a single object. And simplification is tempting, but it's also misleading because the habit isn't driving the behavior. It's accompanying it, like background music that changes how a room feels without directing the conversation. You don't blame the music for what's being said. You notice it only when it's gone. That's how cannabis functions in many lives. Unremarkable until absent. Then, suddenly, the edges feel sharper. The night feels longer. The silence feels heavier. That absence reveals what the habit was quietly doing all along. Not changing identity, not creating desire, just cushioning experience. And cushioning is rarely appreciated until it's missing, which is why so many people cycle in and out of it without drama. They leave when they don't need it. They return when they do. No loyalty, no guilt, just recognition. That fluid relationship is another reason it survives scrutiny. There's nothing to latch onto. No fixed identity. No rigid commitment. Just a repeated choice made in response to similar conditions. And conditions repeat. Work repeats. Fatigue repeats. Evenings repeat. Which means the choice keeps presenting itself again and again, quietly, without fanfare, without a beginning that can be clearly marked, and without an ending that ever really arrives. Because endings require resolution, and this habit doesn't resolve anything. It just makes living inside unresolved things more tolerable. And that, for many people, is enough. More than enough. It's why the story keeps going, why it keeps circling instead of closing, why every attempt to finalize it feels premature. Because as long as people keep looking for ways to sit with time rather than fight it, this habit will keep finding them. And somewhere along the way, people start noticing something that feels almost ironic. The habit that was once blamed for distraction is often what allows people to stay present, not focused in the sharp, productive sense, present in the softer one, listening without preparing a response, sitting without checking the time, letting thoughts come and go without chasing them. That presence doesn't look impressive from the outside, It looks like nothing is happening. And that's the problem. Modern life is trained to distrust moments where nothing appears to be happening. Nothing happening looks like waste. But from the inside, nothing happening can feel like relief. Cannabis settles into that misunderstanding easily. It becomes associated with doing nothing, even when what it's really doing is allowing people to stop performing. Performance is exhausting, even when you're good at it, especially when you're good at it. So the habit becomes a quiet exit ramp, not an escape from life, an exit from constant output. And exits are supposed to be temporary. That's why people keep telling themselves, just tonight. Tonight is harmless. Tonight is small. Tonight doesn't threaten anything. And then tonight repeats. Not every night, just often enough to matter. That repetition creates another subtle shift. People stop thinking of the habit as a break from normal life and start experiencing it as part of normal life's rhythm. Work, return, pause. That rhythm feels balanced, which makes disruption stand out. When the pause is removed, everything else feels louder, sharper, less forgiving. And people don't always connect that discomfort to what's missing. They just know something feels off. So they look for substitutes, distractions, noise, endless scrolling. But those substitutes rarely provide the same softness. They stimulate instead of settle. They fill time instead of stretching it. So people drift back, not because they failed to quit something, because the alternative didn't meet the same need. This is another place where misunderstanding creeps in. Observers assume dependence. But what's often happening is comparison. People aren't clinging to the habit. They're choosing the option that feels less abrasive. And abrasion is a powerful motivator. People will avoid it whenever they can. That avoidance isn't laziness. It's self-preservation. Which brings us to another quiet truth. Cannabis rarely introduces people to rest. It reminds them what rest feels like. Many people already know it from childhood, from long afternoons, from unstructured time, from days before everything was scheduled. The habit doesn't create that feeling. It reopens a door to it. That's why it can feel nostalgic without being tied to a memory, familiar without being specific. And familiarity is persuasive, more persuasive than novelty, which is why this habit doesn't need trends to survive. It doesn't rely on being exciting, it relies on being recognizable. That recognizability crosses generations. People who never speak about it still understand it. They share the same pauses, the same unspoken rules, the same sense of when the day has officially ended. Those shared instincts form a kind of quiet continuity, not a movement, not a tradition, something looser, something that survives because it doesn't demand structure. This looseness frustrates anyone trying to pin it down, because you can't easily regulate something that doesn't insist on form. It shifts just enough to avoid pressure. It settles just enough to remain useful. And usefulness always wins out over ideology in the long run. That's why, when the conversation keeps returning to origins, it never fully satisfies. Because the origin isn't a place, it's a moment. The moment when effort finally releases its grip, when the body decides it has done enough for the day, when the mind is allowed to stop explaining itself. That moment happens again and again, across different lives, across different centuries. And every time it happens, the same small opportunity opens to sit, to breathe, to let time soften instead of sharpen. Cannabis simply learned how to live inside that opportunity, quietly, patiently, without insisting that anyone notice, which is why it's still here, not because it conquered history, but because it never tried to. It just kept finding room in the same human spaces, spaces that don't go away. No matter how fast the world gets, no matter how loud the arguments become, those spaces remain, at the end of the day, at the edge of night, waiting, and then, almost without anyone announcing it, the habit starts drifting away from the group. Not abruptly, not as a rejection, just gradually. At first, it's practical. Someone realizes they don't always want to negotiate the pause with others. They don't want to match their rhythm to someone else's. They don't want to explain why they're quiet. So they sit a little farther away. They arrive later. They stay after everyone else has left. This isn't isolation. It's calibration, finding the exact amount of quiet that fits tonight. Groups are unpredictable. Someone always wants to talk. Someone always wants to fill silence. Someone always wants to turn the pause into a performance. And performance ruins the pause. So the habit slips sideways, into corners, into smaller rooms, into moments where no one is waiting for a response. That's when it starts to feel personal, not owned, personal. The pause now belongs to one body, one mind, one evening. This changes the texture of the experience. There's less laughter, less commentary, less checking to see how others are reacting, more listening, more noticing, more time spent inside thoughts that don't need to go anywhere. For some people, this feels like relief. For others, it feels unsettling. Silence behaves differently when you're alone with it. It doesn't get softened by other voices. It doesn't get redirected. It just sits there. And cannabis doesn't remove that silence. It makes it less sharp. That's an important distinction. It doesn't replace thought. It slows its urgency, which makes solitude feel manageable. This is where a lot of misunderstanding begins. From the outside, solitude looks like withdrawal. It looks like disengagement. It looks like someone stepping back from life. But from the inside, it often feels like re-entry. A chance to feel present without performing, to sit without reacting, to exist without being evaluated. That interior shift is invisible, and invisible shifts are easy to misinterpret. So people start telling stories. They say the habit makes people distant, unmotivated, disconnected. They don't see the internal work being done. They don't see the regulation, the recalibration, the effort it takes to stay balanced in an overstimulating world. So the habit gets blamed for the posture, again, as if the posture came first. This is the same reversal repeating itself. The pause gets treated as the cause instead of the response. And once solitude enters the picture, that reversal intensifies. Because solitude itself makes people nervous. A person comfortable being alone unsettles systems built on constant engagement. Engagement is measurable, silence is not. So silence becomes suspect, and anything associated with it inherits that suspicion. This is where social concern sharpens. Not fear yet, concern. Concern about habits forming outside of supervision. Concern about people learning how to sit with themselves too well. Concern about pauses becoming preferred. That concern doesn't speak plainly. It disguises itself as health, as productivity, as responsibility, all reasonable frames. But they miss the point. The point isn't escape, it's containment. People are trying to contain the overflow of noise. The habit just happens to help. This is when the phrase too much starts appearing, not just about quantity, about presence. You're doing it too much. You're always quiet. You're not engaging. The criticism shifts from the act to the attitude, and attitudes are harder to defend. You can explain an action. You can't easily explain a way of being. So people stop explaining. They nod. They deflect. They keep their pauses private. Privacy deepens. And with it, misunderstanding grows. This is the social gap. On one side, people experiencing the habit as regulation. On the other, people interpreting it as withdrawal. Both are sincere. Both are incomplete. And in between, the habit continues quietly, not escalating, not correcting, just existing where it's useful. This individual turn doesn't erase the collective one. It layers on top of it. Some nights are shared. Some are solitary. The flexibility matters because it allows the habit to fit more lives. Different temperaments, different needs, different tolerances for noise. That adaptability is what keeps it from becoming a rigid identity. It doesn't insist on being communal. It doesn't insist on being solitary. It simply follows the shape of the evening. And evenings change, which is why attempts to define a single type of user always fail. People aren't using it to become something. They're using it to stay functional in very different ways. For one person, it smooths the body. For another, it quiets the mind. For another, it makes solitude less confrontational. Same habit, different jobs. This complexity frustrates anyone trying to pin it down. So, simplifications return. Labels, warnings, generalizations. They flatten the experience into something manageable, but flattening removes nuance. And nuance is where the truth lives. Without nuance, policy overshoots. It treats all pauses as the same, all users as identical, all contexts as interchangeable, which they aren't. So people keep slipping through the cracks, not intentionally, naturally. They don't see themselves in the warnings. They don't recognize their experience in the stories being told. So they keep doing what works for them, quietly, carefully. This is where the habit becomes almost invisible again. Not because it disappeared, because it blended into private routines, into end-of-day rituals, into moments no one audits, which brings us to a subtle turning point. Once something becomes private enough, society stops knowing how common it is. It guesses, and guesses are almost always wrong. They're based on visibility, not prevalence. So the habit gets rediscovered again, as if it's new, as if it's spreading, as if it hasn't been there all along, just living in smaller rooms. This rediscovery triggers the next wave. Concern escalates to alarm. Alarm seeks solutions. Solutions look for causes. And once again, the habit gets named as the problem, not because it suddenly changed, but because it was noticed. Again, this cycle doesn't resolve. It rotates. And every rotation teaches the habit how to be quieter, smaller, more precise, which makes the next rotation slower, less effective, until attention drifts, and silence returns, and people sit, and breathe, and let the evening stretch just enough to feel human again. And once that cycle tightens, things begin to move faster. Attention doesn't linger the way it used to. Stories compress. Assumptions harden. What once took years to notice now takes weeks. Someone sees a pattern and calls it a trend. Someone hears about it and calls it a problem. Someone reacts before understanding what they're reacting to. Speed changes interpretation, and cannabis, which evolved slowly, suddenly finds itself judged quickly. This mismatch matters because slow habits don't respond well to fast conclusions. They don't pivot on command. They don't correct themselves loudly. They keep doing what they've always done, while being talked about more intensely than ever. That intensity creates pressure. Pressure creates simplification. And simplification creates mistakes. This is where the big misunderstanding locks in. People stop asking why the pause exists and start asking how to stop it. Stopping is easier to imagine than understanding. So the conversation narrows. Effects get exaggerated. Risks get foregrounded. Context disappears. The habit becomes a headline instead of a moment. But on the ground, nothing dramatic changes. People still wait until the day loosens, still choose moments that feel safe, still adjust based on what's happening around them. The habit keeps shrinking its footprint, less visible, less social, less discussable, not because it's losing relevance, because relevance doesn't require attention, it requires usefulness, and usefulness remains steady. In fact, it grows. As stimulation increases, tolerance decreases. Noise multiplies. Notifications interrupt. Silence becomes rare. Under those conditions, anything that reliably softens experience gains value. Not symbolic value, practical value. Cannabis doesn't need advocacy to benefit from that. It doesn't need promotion. It just needs evenings to keep ending. And they do, every day. This is where the modern misunderstanding peaks. People look at the presence of the habit and assume novelty. They assume spread. They assume influence. They miss persistence. Persistence doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly, which is why comparisons across time feel off. People say, it wasn't like this before, but it was. It just wasn't visible the same way. Different tools, different rooms, different language, same pause, same need, same response. This is also where replacement fantasies fail. People assume if you remove one habit, another will take its place seamlessly. But replacements don't always align. They stimulate instead of settle. They distract instead of soften. They fill time instead of stretching it. So people try them. They scroll. They binge. They consume noise. And eventually, they get tired. Because stimulation is effort in disguise, it demands attention. Cannabis doesn't. It allows attention to drift without pulling it anywhere. That difference matters more as life accelerates, which is why the habit doesn't fade with progress. It becomes more selective, more intentional, more efficient. Efficiency doesn't always mean doing more. Sometimes it means doing less, better, better timing, better context, better restraint. Those refinements don't look dramatic. They look invisible until absence makes them obvious. When the pause is gone, the edges return. The day feels longer. The silence feels heavier. The mind pushes when it doesn't need to, and people notice. Not intellectually, physically. That physical noticing is persuasive. More persuasive than arguments. More persuasive than warnings. So people make choices quietly. They don't announce them. They don't defend them. They just align their evenings with what feels tolerable. This alignment keeps repeating. Across demographics. Across belief systems. Across eras. Which is why attempts to date the beginning always feel unsatisfying, because beginnings imply intention, and this habit never needed one. It didn't start as a statement. It started as a response to long days, to waiting, to silence that needed softening. Those conditions didn't appear once. They appear constantly, which means the response keeps being rediscovered again and again and again, sometimes loudly, often quietly, always patiently. And patience is the habit's greatest advantage. It doesn't rush to justify itself. It doesn't hurry to be understood. It just stays close to the moments where people need it. Moments that aren't glamorous. Moments that don't get documented. Moments at the end of effort, at the edge of night, where time finally loosens and no one asks it to tighten again. That's where the habit lives best. Not at the center of attention. At the end of the day, waiting, and at some point, the arguments stop changing. They recycle. The same concerns return with different vocabulary. The same warnings arrive dressed as new discoveries. The same questions get asked as if no one has asked them before. That repetition is telling, because repetition without resolution usually means the problem isn't where people think it is. They keep circling the habit, but the tension lives elsewhere, in pace, in pressure, in lives that don't leave much room for being unproductive without guilt. Cannabis just happens to sit at the intersection of those pressures, which makes it visible whenever things feel too tight. This is why it keeps getting pulled into debates about motivation, work ethic, focus, ambition, all loaded words, all words that assume humans should be pushing forward most of the time. The habit quietly disagrees, not by arguing, by existing. It suggests that maybe constant forward motion isn't sustainable, that maybe some pauses aren't rewards, but requirements. That suggestion is uncomfortable, because if pauses are required, then the system asking for endless output is flawed, and it's easier to blame a habit than to question a system. So the habit absorbs the criticism. Again, this is where another misunderstanding locks in. People assume that if something helps people tolerate pressure, it must be the reason they accept pressure in the first place. As if relief causes exploitation, as if comfort creates endurance. In reality, endurance is already demanded. Relief just makes it survivable. But survivable systems tend to persist. And that's where the ethical knot tightens. Is the habit a coping tool, or part of what allows the pressure to continue? That question never gets answered cleanly, because it depends on context, on how much pressure exists, on how much agency someone has, on what alternatives are available. Nuance again. And nuance is always the first casualty of fast arguments. So the debate stays stuck. While real lives keep unfolding, people still come home tired, still look for ways to decompress that don't require effort, still choose the option that feels least abrasive. That choice isn't ideological, it's sensory. What feels better in the body, that's what wins. Which is why, when people talk about waves of popularity, they're often confusing visibility with need. Need doesn't come in waves. It hums, constantly, sometimes louder, sometimes quieter, but always there. This is also where generational confusion creeps in. Each generation thinks it's encountering something new, something unprecedented. Because the context feels new, the technology is new, the pace is new, the pressures are new, so they assume the response must be new as well. They don't recognize the shape, but the shape is familiar. a small, controllable pause, a way to soften experience without disengaging completely, a ritual that doesn't require belief. Those shapes repeat across time even when the surface changes, which is why the question keeps resurfacing in different forms. Why now? Why this? Why so many people? As if the answer isn't sitting quietly in plain sight. People are tired, not dramatically, consistently, and consistent fatigue produces consistent behavior, not rebellion, not collapse. Adaptation. Cannabis is one adaptation among many. It just happens to be one that doesn't shout, which makes it easy to misunderstand, easy to project onto, easy to turn into a symbol for whatever anxiety is dominant at the moment. But symbols crack under weight. The lived experience underneath doesn't. People keep returning to the same small decision, to slow instead of speed, to sit instead of scroll, to let thoughts blur instead of sharpen. That decision doesn't feel political, it feels physical. And physical needs don't respond well to rhetoric. They respond to sensation, which is why, no matter how much the conversation accelerates, the habit doesn't. It keeps its pace. Slow, predictable, patient, waiting for the moment when the day finally loosens, when expectations drop, when no one is asking for anything else. Those moments are still abundant, even in the loudest eras, especially in the loudest eras. And as long as those moments exist, the habit doesn't need defending. It just needs to be available, available enough to be chosen quietly, without ceremony, without justification, without anyone feeling like they've crossed a line. That quiet choosing is what has always carried it forward. Not campaigns, not movements, just millions of small, unremarkable evenings where people decide to make time feel softer instead of sharper. Again and again and again. And eventually, the habit stops being the loudest thing in the room. Something else takes that role. Noise, not sound noise. Information arriving constantly. Opinions overlapping. Urgency pretending to be important. Noise doesn't end when the day ends. It follows people home, into their pockets, onto their screens, into the quiet moments that used to belong to no one. This changes the role of the pause. Before, the pause followed effort. Now, it protects against intrusion. Cannabis shifts with that change. It's no longer just about resting after work. It's about drawing a boundary, a soft one, a boundary that says, this moment isn't available, not unavailable forever, just unavailable right now. That distinction matters because people don't want to disconnect from life. They want to stop being interrupted by it. And interruption feels physical now. A buzz, a vibration, a glow in the corner of the eye. The body reacts before the mind does. So the pause becomes defensive, not reactive, protective. This is another reason misunderstanding grows. From the outside, it looks like retreat. From the inside, it feels like regulation, a way to bring the nervous system back into a range that feels human, not euphoric, not numb, just tolerable. This is where comparisons to earlier eras start to break down. People argue using old language, addiction, escapism, avoidance. Those words don't quite fit anymore because the threat isn't boredom, it's overload, and overload requires a different kind of response. Something that doesn't add more input, something that doesn't demand attention, something that lets attention loosen. Cannabis does that quietly, which makes it useful in ways that aren't immediately obvious. It doesn't compete with stimulation. It neutralizes it. That neutrality is subtle, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. Until it's gone, then the contrast becomes obvious. Without the pause, everything feels louder, more demanding, less forgiving. People notice how quickly they become irritable, how hard it is to sit still, how thoughts stack instead of flow. Those sensations drive behavior more than arguments ever could. So people adjust. They don't announce it. They don't justify it. They just make small changes to protect their evenings. Later hours, smaller spaces, fewer people, the habit becomes even more compact, even more efficient. It takes up less time, less space, less explanation, which makes it harder to spot. And when something becomes harder to spot, estimates become exaggerated. People assume growth because they can't measure presence accurately. They mistake invisibility for expansion. They confuse private use with widespread adoption. That confusion fuels another wave of concern, another round of discussion, another set of solutions aimed at the wrong layer. And once again, the habit remains mostly unaffected because it isn't responding to discourse. It's responding to conditions, and the conditions continue. Days are still long, noise is still constant, rest still feels earned instead of allowed. As long as those patterns hold, something will keep answering them. Cannabis is one answer, not the only one, but a consistent one, and consistency is persuasive. People trust what behaves the same way across different moods, across different weeks, across different phases of life. That trust doesn't turn into devotion. It turns into familiarity. Familiarity lowers resistance, which is why people don't dramatize their relationship with it. They don't frame it as a turning point. They frame it as a preference, a way things feel better arranged. And preferences don't provoke the same scrutiny as identities. You can argue against who someone claims to be. It's harder to argue against how someone prefers their evenings to feel. That preference doesn't ask permission. It doesn't demand validation. It just shapes behavior quietly. This is where the story slows again, not because nothing is happening, but because everything has settled into pattern. A pattern that repeats. Effort, noise, pause, effort, noise, pause. The repetition is the point, not the novelty, which is why questions about beginnings keep missing the mark. Because this isn't a story about discovery. It's a story about recurrence. About humans repeatedly finding the same solution to slightly different versions of the same problem, over and over, with different tools, in different rooms, under different names, but always in response to the same sensation. That feeling that the day has taken enough, that it's time to stop pushing, time to let things blur instead of sharpen. Cannabis just learned how to sit with that moment without asking it to change. And that skill, quiet, patient, unremarkable, is why it keeps being there, waiting right where people leave space for it. And at some point, the habit stops being discussed as a choice at all. It becomes a setting, like lighting, like background temperature, something that shapes how the evening feels without demanding attention. People don't say, "I'm going to do this now." They say, "I'm done for today." That distinction matters, because being done isn't an action, it's a state. Cannabis settles into that state easily, not as an event, as a transition, the moment where effort gives way to tolerance. And tolerance is underrated. It's not joy. It's not excitement. It's the ability to stay with experience without needing to escape it. That's a quiet skill, And quiet skills don't announce themselves. They just make things smoother. This smoothing effect is what often gets mislabeled as numbness. From the outside, less reaction looks like less feeling. From the inside, it often feels like fewer spikes, fewer sharp edges, fewer moments where everything demands response at once. That reduction doesn't erase emotion, it redistributes it. Emotions spread out instead of clustering, which makes them easier to sit with. That's not absence, that's regulation. But regulation is invisible when it's working, so people only notice when it's gone. When evenings feel harsher, when silence presses instead of rests, when thoughts stack instead of drift, those sensations bring people back. Not with urgency, with recognition, like returning to a room that feels familiar even if you haven't been there in a while. This return pattern confuses observers. They expect escalation, dependence, loss of control. Instead, they see people coming and going, using less, using differently, stopping, starting again. That fluidity doesn't fit the standard narratives. So new narratives get written. They focus on extremes, on excess, on the loudest examples. Because quiet moderation doesn't travel well. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't scare. And fear is what most public conversations are built around. Fear simplifies. Fear accelerates. Fear turns nuance into threat. Cannabis survives fear not by confronting it, but by avoiding its center. It stays peripheral in evenings, in private routines, in moments no one audits closely. This peripheral existence is strategic without being planned. It's learned over time, through trial, through attention, through knowing when to be present and when to recede. That knowledge accumulates culturally, even when it isn't spoken, even when it isn't agreed upon. People just know. They know when it's appropriate. They know when it's not worth the friction. They know when silence will be misunderstood. And they adjust. That adjustment is why the habit doesn't collapse under scrutiny. It bends, and bending keeps things intact. This bending also prevents it from becoming a fixed identity. People don't need to defend it as part of who they are. They don't need to evangelize. They don't need to convince anyone. They just choose it when it fits and leave it when it doesn't. That optionality is powerful. Optional things don't provoke the same backlash as commitments. They don't threaten structures. They slip around them, which is why, over long stretches of time, the habit doesn't look like a movement. It looks like a constant background adjustment people make to remain tolerable to themselves. Not happier, not better. Just okay enough to keep going. That modest goal is easy to dismiss, but it's incredibly motivating. People will do a lot to feel okay enough, especially when alternatives are louder, harsher, more demanding. This is where the question keeps resurfacing in new forms. Not when did it start, but why does it keep coming back? And the answer is always the same, even when it's dressed differently. Because the pressures keep coming back too. Because days keep asking more than they give. Because silence keeps getting crowded out. Because rest keeps feeling conditional. As long as those patterns remain, something will keep answering them. Cannabis is one answer that learned how to stay small, how to stay quiet, how to stay adaptable. That adaptability is what makes it feel both old and new at the same time. Old because the need it answers is ancient. New because the conditions keep changing. So each generation thinks it's encountering it for the first time. They give it new names, new frames, new arguments. And underneath all of that, the same small behavior continues. Someone sits down, someone exhales, someone lets the evening stop demanding things for a while. That moment doesn't belong to history. It belongs to repetition. And repetition doesn't need an origin story. It just needs to keep happening, which it does, night after night, in rooms both old and new, waiting quietly for anyone who decides they don't need to push anymore. And when you stay with it long enough, something becomes clear without ever being stated. This habit was never trying to stand out. It was trying to blend into evenings that feel unfinished, blend into rooms where nothing important is happening anymore, blend into the stretch of time people don't know how to use productively. That blending is why it keeps slipping past definitions. Every time someone tries to name it too precisely, it changes how it shows up. Not out of rebellion, out of comfort. It prefers places where no one is counting minutes, where no one is measuring outcomes, where no one expects progress. Those places still exist, even now. They exist late at night, in half-lit rooms, in the quiet after conversations end but before sleep begins. That in-between has always been fertile ground, not for ideas, for tolerance. Tolerance of unfinished thoughts, tolerance of boredom, tolerance of being still without explanation. Cannabis fits there because it doesn't demand resolution. It doesn't push thoughts to conclusions. It lets them fade. That fading is misunderstood as loss, but often it's relief. Relief from having to finish everything, from having to decide, from having to respond immediately. Immediate response is exhausting, especially when it's constant. So the habit becomes a way to delay response without refusing it. A way to say, not right now, without saying anything at all. That subtlety matters, because outright refusal invites conflict. Delay invites patience, and patience keeps things calm. This is another reason the habit survives tension. It doesn't escalate, it de-escalates. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to keep the evening from tipping into restlessness. Enough to keep silence from feeling sharp. Enough to keep the body from staying on alert when there's nothing left to guard against. That's a physiological need, not a cultural one. Bodies don't care about arguments. They care about states. Alert, resting, settling. Cannabis helps some bodies shift states more gently. That's all. No transformation, no awakening. Just a smoother transition from one mode to another. Transitions are fragile moments. That's when discomfort spikes. That's when people feel restless, irritable, impatient. Anything that eases transitions becomes valuable quickly, which is why this habit keeps finding its way back into lives during periods of change. New jobs, new cities, new routines, new pressures. Transitions multiply as life accelerates, and acceleration has been steady for a long time now. So the need for gentle transitions grows, not loudly, consistently. This is where the habit stops feeling optional to some people, not necessary, reliable. Reliability doesn't excite, but it anchors, and anchors are quiet. They don't move, they just hold. That holding is invisible unless you imagine its absence. If the pause disappeared entirely, if evenings stayed sharp until sleep, if silence never softened, if thoughts never slowed on their own, most people don't want that. Even the ones who argue against the habit don't want that. They want rest. They just disagree about how rest should be achieved. But disagreement doesn't erase need. It just complicates access, which is why the habit continues in parallel with the argument, outside the spotlight, outside the debate, in the same places it has always lived. Private moments, low expectations, unclaimed time. This is also why the habit doesn't age the way trends do. Trends peak and fall. They need attention. This habit doesn't. It's fine being ignored. In fact, it prefers it. Ignored things don't get regulated aggressively. They don't get optimized. They don't get turned into something else. They stay close to their original function. And the original function here was never celebration. It was endurance. Endurance without drama. Endurance without heroism. Just enough softness to keep going tomorrow. That modest goal is easy to overlook, but it's one of the strongest motivators humans have. People don't always want more. Often they want less. Less friction, less urgency, less sharpness. Cannabis offers that reduction without demanding explanation, which is why, even now, the habit doesn't feel finished. It feels ongoing, like something that keeps adjusting itself to the shape of evenings as they change. Different light, different noise, different pressures, same need, same response. Sit, breathe, let the day finally loosen its grip. That's not a movement, it's a rhythm, and rhythms don't end. They fade in and out. They repeat, they wait, just like this one, still waiting. Every night, in whatever quiet space people manage to protect for themselves. And when you let it run long enough, the habit almost disappears into the background of ordinary life. Not because it loses importance, because it loses sharp edges. It stops announcing itself. No rituals that demand attention. No declarations. No clear moment where something begins. It just happens, like sitting down without thinking about sitting, like lowering your voice because the room asks for it. That's when people stop framing it as an activity. They frame it as atmosphere. The evening feels different. That's all. And atmosphere is difficult to argue with. You can debate actions. You can criticize choices. But how do you debate a feeling? How do you outlaw a texture? That's why so many conversations around this habit feel slightly misaligned. They're aiming at the wrong layer. They target the object, the method, the visible behavior. But the behavior is only the surface. Underneath is a pattern of managing time, pressure, and attention. That pattern doesn't go away when you remove one element. It looks for another. So even when people step away from the habit, the shape remains. They replace it with long showers, with silence in parked cars, with walking routes that take longer than necessary. The pause migrates, because the pause is the point. Cannabis just happened to be one of the earliest tools people found that fit neatly into that pause. Simple, portable, predictable. Those qualities matter more than novelty ever could. Novelty excites. Predictability soothes. And soothing is underrated, especially in cultures that reward excitement and punish stillness. That punishment is subtle. It shows up as guilt, as restlessness, as the feeling that you should be doing something else. Cannabis doesn't remove that voice entirely. It lowers the volume, just enough. Enough to let people sit without immediately negotiating with their conscience. That's a small thing, but small things done consistently shape lives. Not dramatically, gradually, which is why the habit never needed a movement to survive. It didn't need protection. It needed alignment. Alignment with bodies that get tired, with minds that get crowded, with evenings that feel too long and too short at the same time. That alignment keeps happening over and over. in different forms, under different names, but always recognizable to the people experiencing it, even if they don't talk about it, especially if they don't. Silence protects familiarity. It keeps things from being overdefined. Overdefined things get rigid. Rigid things break. This habit stayed flexible by staying quiet, by allowing contradictions, by letting people come and go without demanding consistency. Some people need it for a while, some only occasionally, some move on entirely. None of that threatens it, because it doesn't rely on loyalty. It relies on recurrence, on the fact that the same conditions keep reappearing. Long days, crowded minds, evenings that need softening. As long as those exist, the option remains relevant, not urgent, relevant. And relevance doesn't need defending, it just waits. Which brings us back, gently, to where we started. Not to a date, not to a place, but to a moment. The moment when the day finally stops asking for things, when effort releases its grip, when nothing important is left to decide. That moment has existed for as long as humans have had days. And every time it appears, people look for ways to inhabit it without friction. Sometimes they talk, sometimes they sleep, sometimes they stare into space. Sometimes they find a way to let time soften. Cannabis was never the beginning of that instinct. It was one of the quieter answers to it, an answer that didn't insist on being the center of attention, an answer that learned how to wait. And waiting, as it turns out, is a very effective way to last. And so it doesn't really end. It just loosens, the way a room loosens when the lights are lowered a little more. The way conversation thins until it's mostly pauses. The way time stops asking to be filled. Nothing needs to be decided now. Nothing needs to be understood better than it already is. The habit fades back into the background where it's most comfortable. Not gone, just not demanding attention anymore. Like the last glow of embers after the fire has stopped needing wood. The day is already finished. The night has already claimed its space. There's no need to mark the moment. No need to remember when it started. No need to wonder where it goes next. It will be there again whenever evenings stretch too long. Whenever silence feels a little too sharp on its own. Whenever time needs softening instead of filling. Until then, it waits, patiently, the way it always has. And the room stays quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for anything back. Just enough to let you stay where you are. A little longer, without pushing, without explaining, just resting in the pause. And that's enough.